Hello everyone, welcome back to Paranormal M. It's nice to have you here. Before we get into tonight's stories, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And if you've gone through anything paranormal yourself, you can always send your story to me. The first story tonight is about a family who began noticing odd things happening in their daughter's room, and what first seemed small ended up becoming something that really shook them. Alright, let's get started, and I hope you have a good night and sleep well after this. Hey, I've got a story that still gives me chills when I think about it, and honestly, I'm not even sure what to make of it. So, this all started in my little daughter Mara's room. She's 2 years old, and up until all of this, her room was just her room. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. My wife and I are not religious people at all. My wife is a little open-minded about spiritual stuff, I guess, but I've always been the skeptic in the house. A while back, we started hearing noises coming from Mara's closet. Not constantly, but often enough that it caught our attention. It sounded like knocking or something bumping lightly against the closet doors. Every time we checked, there was nothing there. No vents, no pets, no obvious explanation. It was strange, and even though Mara mostly brushed it off, it definitely left my wife and me with that unsettled feeling you can't quite shake. Then one evening, I was in the bathroom next to her room giving her a bath when I heard this loud crash. I called out, my wife came running, and I went straight into Mara's room. A whole stack of books had fallen from a high wall shelf onto the floor. Now, these weren't books loosely stacked on a ledge. They were on one of those front-facing nursery shelves where the books sit pretty securely. I even tested it afterward because I wanted a reasonable explanation. I tried to see if they could just slip out on their own, but they really couldn't. And the strangest part was that only the books from the top shelf had come down. The lower shelves were untouched. Those books hadn't even been handled in weeks. After that, things went quiet for a while. No more closet noises, no more weird moments. We actually started to think maybe it had all just been a string of odd but harmless little incidents. Then another night, during bath time again, I heard another crash. This time, I walked into Mara's room and found a framed picture lying flat on her changing table. What made that one so unsettling was how it had been placed before. The frame had been sitting on a shelf above the table, leaning against the wall, and there were several little items in front of it, including a baby monitor camera. But somehow, the picture ended up down on the changing table, while everything else stayed almost exactly where it was. Nothing had been knocked over. Nothing had fallen with it. The camera had shifted just slightly, barely at all. I checked the footage because the camera is motion activated. About 10 minutes earlier, it had recorded me going into the room to put something away. The frame was definitely still on the shelf then. The recording showed me leaving, then it stopped. It didn't catch the picture falling. It only started recording again when I walked back in and found it already down. That really got under my skin. Then came the night that honestly rattled both of us the most. Mara woke up right around 3 a.m. My wife went to get her, and when she brought her into our room, our daughter was completely beside herself. I don't mean normal toddler crying. I mean she was writhing, screaming, sobbing, totally inconsolable. It looked like she was terrified or in pain, and we had never seen her like that before. It felt so intense and so out of character that it genuinely scared us. And then, after all that, she just suddenly wore herself out and fell asleep. The next day she was completely fine, totally normal, laughing, playing, acting like nothing had happened. And there's one more thing. Her room is always colder than the rest of the house. Not a little colder, noticeably colder. The bathroom next door feels normal. The guest room on the other side feels normal. But her room stays several degrees cooler for no clear reason. We even checked with sensors because I started thinking maybe I was imagining it, but no, it really is colder in there. On top of that, She'd also started waking up in the middle of the night for weeks, which was unusual for her because she had always been a great sleeper. And I know this next part sounds dramatic, but when I realized so much of this seemed to center around 3 a.m., I did what everyone does when they're freaked out and sleep deprived. I started searching online. I found all kinds of folklore and religious interpretations tied to that hour, and suddenly, I was connecting dots I probably shouldn't have been connecting. But when you're already unsettled, your mind goes wandering. We live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and people around here love to talk about the spiritual history of the place. Hauntings, old energy, all of that. Our house isn't even especially old, so I keep trying to tell myself there has to be some practical explanation. But I'll be honest with you. When you hear sounds with no source, see things move that really shouldn't move, watch your child react in a way you've never seen before, and feel that chill in the room over and over again, it starts to wear on you. So that's where I am. Part of me wants to explain every bit of it away. Another part of me can't deny how unsettling it has all felt while we were living through it. And I still don't know what to think. I grew up in a small village in Romania, in an old family house that, on paper, seemed completely ordinary. Its history was never especially dramatic. As far as we know, the people who lived there before us were religious people, church-going, respectable. Nothing that would make you immediately think something was wrong. And yet, from as far back as I can remember, that house never felt entirely right to me. Most of whatever was in there seemed strongest in the kitchen, though strange things happened in other rooms too. I'm actually staying in the house again now, and I may try recording overnight just to see if anything turns up. Honestly, I'm not expecting much beyond odd sounds. Still, after everything I've experienced there, I can't really ignore it either. The first thing I remember happened when I was around 6. I was sleeping in a room where the door had a glass pane in it, and from my bed, I could see straight through that little window. I was still scared of sleeping in the dark back then, so my mother would always leave the hallway light on for me. One night, sometime very late, I woke up and looked toward the door. Standing there, visible through the glass, was a hooded figure watching me. I was half asleep and thought maybe it was my grandmother, because she used to wear a headscarf tied in that old-fashioned way. So I called out to her. The moment I did, the figure turned its head to the side, and then another hooded figure appeared beside it. It looked like the two of them were talking to each other, though I couldn't hear a thing. Then, after a few seconds, both of them turned sharply and moved out of view. And just as they did, a third figure slipped past after them. I remember lying there frozen, staring at the door, too afraid to even pull the blanket over my head. Another time, in a different bedroom, I was home alone, just lying there messing around on my phone. Out of nowhere, I saw what looked like fire appear in the upper corner of the wall near the door. It spread incredibly fast, racing across the wall toward the frame. For a second, it looked like flames were pushing around the edges of the door itself, like something was about to burst through. And then, it was gone. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 seconds. I ran to look, expecting smoke or scorch marks, or at least some sign that I hadn't imagined it. But there was nothing. The wall was untouched. The old wooden door, which had been in the house since before my father bought it, looked exactly the same as always. That same door was involved in something else that I still can't explain. Again, I was alone in the house, sitting on the bed with my phone, when the door suddenly started shaking hard. Not a gentle rattle either. I mean, violent, aggressive shaking, like someone on the other side was trying to force their way in. I jumped up immediately and grabbed the handle, expecting resistance, expecting someone to be there. But the second I touched it, everything stopped. I yanked the door open right away and checked the hallway, then the other rooms. No one was there. Nothing had fallen, no windows were open, no explanation made sense. That one shook me badly because it felt physical and real in a way that's hard to brush off. A few years later, maybe when I was around 12 or 13, I had another encounter in the kitchen. It was around 9 at night. I'd gone in to heat up some leftovers while my mother and my younger brother were each in their rooms. The microwave was near the back of the kitchen, close to the door that leads outside. When it beeped, I walked over to get my food. I was only a couple of steps away when, right in front of me, a black figure appeared for a split second. It was tall, thin, almost unnaturally narrow, and it stood maybe a meter away from me. It vanished so quickly that part of me wanted to call it a trick of the eyes. But I know what I saw, and I remember exactly how cold my whole body felt in that moment. What unsettles me even more is that it wasn't just me. My little brother, who's a bit younger, eventually admitted that he'd had his own experiences too. He told me he'd heard whispering in the kitchen when nobody else was there. He also said that once, while he was in the bathroom, he looked toward the little window in the door and saw a dark figure standing outside, staring in. The strangest thing he described was seeing, from the corner of his eye, what looked like a long, dark shape sitting upright on one of the beds, so tall it nearly reached the ceiling. He said it leaned slightly, as if it were watching. And then there's everything else. The smaller things. The things that sound less dramatic when you say them out loud, but add up over time until the whole house feels wrong. There were nights when I'd catch what looked like faces or human shapes hovering above me just before sleep. I used to try recording sounds in the house, hoping for something clear enough to prove I wasn't imagining it all. Most of the time, the only things I caught were strange voices, breathing, or noises that didn't belong there. I know how this sounds. I really do. And I'm not asking anyone to believe every word automatically. I'm just telling you what happened in that house, as honestly as I can. Maybe there's an explanation for all of it. Maybe there isn't. But when you grow up in a place where the silence never feels empty, you start to trust that feeling. And in that house, especially in that kitchen, I never once felt alone. You know, I grew up in a house with a kind of history that seemed to cling to the walls. The land had been settled way back in the 1840s, and even when I was little, parts of the original property were still there. Some of the old outbuildings were standing, weathered but stubborn, on the section that hadn't been divided up yet. Our house itself was newer. It was part of a neighborhood that started going in during the 1970s, but our place wasn't actually built until 1988. What made it feel different, though, was where it sat, right beside the old barn and those original buildings, like it had 1 foot in the present and 1 foot somewhere much older. My grandfather, whose name was Walter, died in that house in 1991 when I was still a baby, only a few months old. My mom used to say he had come there to die, and even as a kid, that phrase stayed with me. It felt heavy, strange, like it meant more than what she was saying out loud. For as long as I can remember, I never felt completely alone in that house. It wasn't always frightening, at least not at first. One of the earliest things I remember is being out on the swings in the backyard and seeing a woman on horseback passing through. She always seemed gentle. She'd smile, lift her hand, and wave to me, and I'd wave right back like it was the most normal thing in the world. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. Our neighbors had horses, so to me it made perfect sense. But one day my mom saw me waving and asked who I was waving at. I told her, just as casually as anything, that I was waving to the lady riding her horse through the yard. And she looked at me and said there was no woman there. She told me the neighbors never rode through our property. Looking back now, what stands out is how she was dressed. Even then, something about her clothes felt old-fashioned. Not costume old, but genuinely from another time. maybe late 1800s, early 1900s. I didn't have the words for that as a child, but I do now. And then there was my grandfather. When I was young, I remember waking up at night and seeing him standing in the living room. He looked faint, almost translucent, but recognizable. Just there, quiet, watching. I was so scared of seeing him that whenever I had to cross the living room to get to my parents' room at night, I'd shut my eyes and hurry through, hoping that if I couldn't see him, maybe he wouldn't be there. Years later, my mom admitted that she'd experienced things too. She told me she believed he had stayed behind in some way. At one point, 2 different mediums came through the house at different times, and both of them mentioned an older man's spirit attached to the property. I know how that sounds, I really do. And even now, part of me resists it. But there were other moments too, things that are harder to explain away. One afternoon, my sister and I came home early from school and went to change before heading next door to the babysitters. We were the only ones home. Then we heard this huge crash downstairs, like a sudden burst of chaos in the kitchen. We both froze, then ran to look. The chairs around the breakfast table had been knocked over, and every cabinet door in the kitchen was standing open. Every one of them. We had only been upstairs for a minute or two. No one could have come in, done all that, and vanished without us seeing or hearing more than that one violent burst of noise. But the encounter that stayed with me most happened just before I turned 8. I was in my bedroom getting ready for bed. I had this routine where I'd pull on my pajamas, jump onto my twin bed, then hop off and head into the hallway to brush my teeth. One night, I jumped onto the bed, and when I landed, there was a boy standing right there in front of me, maybe 6 inches away. He looked about my age. He had reddish hair, freckles, and pale eyes. He was translucent, but clear enough that I can still picture him. I remember the shock of it, the way my whole body seemed to stop. It was only a second, maybe less, and then he was gone. After that, sleeping in that room became almost impossible. For a long time, I'd sleep in the family room instead, or on the floor in my parents' bedroom, anywhere but there. And every now and then, I'd see that same boy again, outside this time, moving through the backyard or near the neighboring pasture. He never spoke. He never came toward me. He would just be there for a moment and then disappear. Even now, I'd still say I'm skeptical by nature. I don't jump to supernatural explanations. I still question my own memory sometimes, but these moments have stayed with me for years, and they're only a few of the things that happened in that house. Whatever it was, whether it was memory, imagination, something spiritual, or something I'll never have words for, that place never felt empty. Not once. You know, I still think about this one sometimes, because even now, I cannot neatly file it away under anything sensible. Back then, my former wife and I both worked in the office of a company. Part of her job involved helping coordinate arrangements when someone passed away. It was just one of those responsibilities that landed on her desk, and over time she got used to calling the same funeral home whenever she needed to handle those details. There was always one woman there who helped her, and for this story, I'll call her Marion. My memory is not flawless, so a few details are a little softened by time, but the heart of it is exactly how it happened. One day my wife called, like she always did, to make arrangements for a viewing. This time, though, a different woman answered and helped her. I'll call her Nina. My wife didn't think much of it. She just figured Marion was busy, and Nina seemed kind and confident, like she knew exactly what she was doing. As they were going over everything, Nina asked whether my wife wanted the flowers delivered the evening before the viewing or the morning of. That caught my wife off guard because Marion had never asked her that before. She wasn't sure which was better. Nina told her, very matter-of-factly, that since the viewing was going to be fairly early, it might be safer to have the flowers brought in the night before so there wouldn't be any delays. That sounded reasonable, so my wife agreed. A little later that same day, Marion called her, and right away, Marion sounded puzzled, maybe even a little irritated. She asked why the flowers were being delivered the night before. My wife explained that Nina had suggested it. Marion told her no, that was a mistake, that flowers should not sit overnight because by morning they could start to droop and look tired. She said it would be much better to have them delivered the day of the viewing. So my wife said, "All right, let's change it." Marion told her she'd take care of it, and that was that. Then the next day, Nina called to go over a few final details. In the middle of the conversation, she mentioned that the flowers had already been delivered and that they looked beautiful. My wife stopped her and said, "No, that couldn't be right." She explained that she had spoken to Marion, and Marion had changed the delivery to the morning of the viewing. There was this pause. Then Nina said, very quietly, that my wife must be mistaken. My wife said, "No, I'm not mistaken. Marion is the woman who always helps me. I know who I spoke to." And that's when Nina told her that Marion had passed away about a year earlier. My wife came straight to my office after that and told me the whole story. I worked in records at the time, and I remember listening to her thinking, that is eerie, sure, but there has to be some ordinary explanation. A crossed line, a misunderstanding, a wrong name, something. After she left, I started digging. She was the kind of person who wrote everything down, every call, every time, every detail. So I pulled the file for the deceased person whose arrangements she'd been handling, and there they were, written out in her notes. One note said she had spoken to Nina in the afternoon and that Nina recommended delivery the evening before. Another note, written later, said she spoke to Marion, who said to switch the flowers to the morning of because they might wilt overnight. It was all there, clean, clear, documented. I remember staring at those notes, feeling that strange little chill creep up my back. So I went further. I pulled older files, ones from before Marion had died, just to make sure my wife really had always dealt with the same person. And sure enough, there were note after note after note mentioning Marion by name. She was real. She had been the regular contact all along. At that point, I thought maybe someone at the funeral home was playing some bizarre prank, but that didn't make sense either. It was a small place. The owner was older. His son worked there too, and after Marion died, Nina had taken over her role. It didn't feel like the kind of place where anyone would do something cruel or theatrical like that. So I looked online and found Marion's obituary. She had, in fact, worked at that funeral home, and she had, in fact, died the year before. What really unsettled me, though, was what came next. As I kept reading, I noticed the date and time listed for her own visitation, and the timing lined up almost perfectly with when my wife said Marion had called her back. That was the moment that got me. Not just because of the date, and not just because of the hour, but because suddenly this strange story had a shape to it that I could not explain away. It felt less like a mistake and more like something reaching across a thin place in the world. I got goosebumps right there at my desk. Now, to be fair, I've changed the names here, and I've smoothed over some of the exact dates because I don't trust my memory enough to swear to every number. But the pattern was real. The notes were real. The obituary was real. And the timing was close enough to stop me cold. I still do not have a tidy explanation for it. Maybe it was an incredible coincidence. Maybe there was some perfectly logical detail I never uncovered. Or maybe Marion was still there in some quiet way, still doing what she had always done, still trying to help one more family put things in order. I can't prove that, of course. I just know that when I read those records and saw how everything lined up, it didn't feel like a joke, and it didn't feel like confusion. It felt like a call from someone who, somehow, had not entirely left. I still think about this one sometimes, because even now, I cannot neatly file it away under anything sensible. Back then, my former wife and I both worked in the office of a company. Part of her job involved helping coordinate arrangements when someone passed away. It was just one of those responsibilities that landed on her desk, and over time she got used to calling the same funeral home whenever she needed to handle those details. There was always one woman there who helped her, and for this story, I'll call her Marion. My memory is not flawless, so a few details are a little softened by time, but the heart of it is exactly how it happened. One day my wife called, like she always did, to make arrangements for a viewing. This time, though, a different woman answered and helped her. I'll call her Nina. My wife didn't think much of it. She just figured Marion was busy, and Nina seemed kind and confident, like she knew exactly what she was doing. As they were going over everything, Nina asked whether my wife wanted the flowers delivered the evening before the viewing or the morning of. That caught my wife off guard because Marion had never asked her that before. She wasn't sure which was better. Nina told her, very matter-of-factly, that since the viewing was going to be fairly early, it might be safer to have the flowers brought in the night before so there wouldn't be any delays. That sounded reasonable, so my wife agreed. A little later that same day, Marion called her, and right away, Marion sounded puzzled, maybe even a little irritated. She asked why the flowers were being delivered the night before. My wife explained that Nina had suggested it. Marion told her no, that was a mistake, that flowers should not sit overnight because by morning they could start to droop and look tired. She said it would be much better to have them delivered the day of the viewing. So my wife said, all right, let's change it. Marion told her she'd take care of it, and that was that. Then the next day, Nina called to go over a few final details. In the middle of the conversation, she mentioned that the flowers had already been delivered and that they looked beautiful. My wife stopped her and said, no, that couldn't be right. She explained that she had spoken to Marion, and Marion had changed the delivery to the morning of the viewing. There was this pause. Then Nina said, very quietly, that my wife must be mistaken. My wife said, no, I'm not mistaken. Marion is the woman who always helps me. I know who I spoke to. And that's when Nina told her that Marion had passed away about a year earlier. My wife came straight to my office after that and told me the whole story. I worked in records at the time, and I remember listening to her thinking, that is eerie, sure, but there has to be some ordinary explanation. A crossed line, a misunderstanding, a wrong name, something. After she left, I started digging. She was the kind of person who wrote everything down. Every call, every time, every detail. So I pulled the file for the deceased person whose arrangement she'd been handling, and there they were, written out in her notes. One note said she had spoken to Nina in the afternoon, and that Nina recommended delivery the evening before. Another note, written later, said she spoke to Marion, who said to switch the flowers to the morning of because they might wilt overnight. It was all there, clean, clear, documented. I remember staring at those notes, feeling that strange little chill creep up my back. So I went further. I pulled older files, ones from before Marion had died, just to make sure my wife really had always dealt with the same person. And sure enough, there were note after note after note mentioning Marion by name. She was real. She had been the regular contact all along. At that point, I thought maybe someone at the funeral home was playing some bizarre prank, but that didn't make sense either. It was a small place. The owner was older, his son worked there too, and after Marion died, Nina had taken over her role. It didn't feel like the kind of place where anyone would do something cruel or theatrical like that. So I looked online and found Marion's obituary. She had, in fact, worked at that funeral home, and she had, in fact, died the year before. What really unsettled me, though, was what came next. As I kept reading, I noticed the date and time listed for her own visitation, and the timing lined up almost perfectly with when my wife said Marion had called her back. That was the moment that got me, not just because of the date, and not just because of the hour, but because suddenly this strange story had a shape to it that I could not explain away. It felt less like a mistake and more like something reaching across a thin place in the world. I got goosebumps right there at my desk. Now, to be fair, I've changed the names here, and I've smoothed over some of the exact dates because I don't trust my memory enough to swear to every number. But the pattern was real. The notes were real. The obituary was real. And the timing was close enough to stop me cold. I still do not have a tidy explanation for it. Maybe it was an incredible coincidence. Maybe there was some perfectly logical detail I never uncovered. Or maybe Marion was still there in some quiet way, still doing what she had always done, still trying to help one more family put things in order. I can't prove that, of course. I just know that when I read those records and saw how everything lined up, it didn't feel like a joke, and it didn't feel like confusion. It felt like a call from someone who, somehow, had not entirely left. I need to tell you about something that's been weighing on me, because honestly, I still don't know how to explain it. A while back, I went through some frightening experiences in a place that already felt off somehow. Like the strange things happening there almost belonged to that environment. Since then, my relationship ended, and now something unsettling seems to be happening in our home. And it's involving my kids. For the past few months, my 5-year-old daughter Ellie has been coming into whatever room I'm in and asking what I needed. Every time, I'd tell her I hadn't called for her. At first, I tried to brush it off. I figured maybe she was hearing the TV from another room, or one of her siblings, or maybe she just thought she heard me. But the most recent time really shook me. She came to me looking genuinely worried and said she heard me calling her, and that I sounded upset, like I was crying or hurt. I asked her if she was sure it was my voice, and she said yes, without hesitation. I told her I was okay and that I hadn't called her at all. It felt awful trying to explain it away because I didn't want her to think I didn't believe her. I do believe she heard something. I just don't know what. Then this morning, something happened with my older son that rattled me even more. I got home from work a little after 5 in the morning. 2 of my kids were asleep and the house was quiet. I went straight to my bedroom, shut the door, and started winding down the way I usually do, just scrolling on my phone and reading random things before going to sleep. Around 5:40 or so, there was a knock at my bedroom door. It was my 16-year-old son, Mason, and he looked confused. He asked me what I wanted him to do. I just stared at him because I had no idea what he meant. I opened the door and told him I hadn't asked him to do anything. He asked again, and I told him I'd been in my room since I got home and hadn't called for him once. The color drained from his face. He told me that he had been jolted awake by loud knocking on his bedroom door, and that he heard my voice telling him to get out of bed right now. He said I sounded irritated, even harsh, so he got up and started getting dressed. Then he heard the knocking again, along with my voice telling him to hurry up and get out of his room. My bedroom is only a few steps from his. If that had really happened in the hallway, I should have heard it, even with my door shut. But I heard absolutely nothing. What scared him most was that by the second round of knocking, he was fully awake. He wasn't half dreaming. He was standing there, getting dressed, hearing what he was sure was me. I tried to stay calm for his sake. I told him maybe there was some strange overlap, something we couldn't explain. Maybe even something like hearing a version of me from somewhere else. I don't know if I believe that myself, but I didn't want to dismiss what he experienced, because I could see how real it was to him. And I definitely didn't want to frighten him with darker ideas. The truth is, I'm scared too. Lately, there have been other things that feel just as strange. Not long ago, a bank card I had misplaced at work somehow turned up inside a storage box at home. Then, not long after that, a PDF downloaded itself onto my son's computer while he was home alone. It was a guide for teens preparing for their driving permit, which stood out because he and I had only talked about it a few days earlier. We hadn't searched for it or signed up for anything yet. It just appeared. I'm trying to stay grounded. I'm trying not to jump to the worst conclusion. But when your children keep hearing your voice when you know you never spoke, it's hard not to feel deeply unsettled. So I'm telling you this the best way I can, because I honestly want to know what you'd think if this were happening in your home. Would you be worried too? Because I am. So, before I tell you what happened that night, I should give you a sense of the place, because honestly, the building itself feels like part of the story. It's an old building, older than anyone I know can fully trace, definitely standing well before 1915. It's huge, the kind of place that seems to keep unfolding the longer you work there. The second and third floors are packed with old offices, most of them sitting empty almost all the time. And there's a big function hall upstairs that we rent out now and then. On the main floor, there's this large bar, and that's where I spend most of my shifts. Down below, there's a basement with a couple of old classroom-style rooms, another smaller event space, and a handful of storage rooms that always feel a little forgotten. There's also this separate lower level near the bar that isn't even connected to the rest of the basement. That area has always unsettled me. It's dim, cramped, and there are these strange blocked-off doorways, sealed over with concrete. Some of the doors are heavy, solid metal, leading into these tiny, dark rooms. I was told years ago they may have been used as shelters. There's also a story that's been passed around by some of the longtime regulars, people who've been coming in since long before I ever worked there. They all tell it almost the exact same way. Supposedly, sometime in the late 80s, a man tried to force his way inside after hours, and an off-duty police officer who happened to be in the building shot him. No one I know has ever been able to fully prove it, but what's strange is how consistent the story is every time it's told. The part that gets to me most is that people say it happened in the area that's now the women's restroom. And I'll just say this, that corner of the bar has always felt off. Anyway, the thing I really wanted to tell you about happened just a few hours before I finally sat down to talk about it. I was closing up for the night, and there was one regular still hanging around after we'd officially shut down. His name's Darren. He's one of those kind, familiar faces, the kind of customer who doesn't just take up space, but actually helps when you're trying to get through the end of a long shift. He asked if I could call him a cab, and while he was waiting, he offered to wipe down a few tables for me. So we were both cleaning, maybe 15 minutes, maybe a little more, when we heard a knock at the front door. Now, that wasn't unusual by itself. Cab drivers who pick people up after closing sometimes knock because the doors are locked and they know we're inside. Darren and I were both close to the entrance, so we got there almost immediately and stepped outside within seconds. The cab was already sitting out front, maybe 50 or 60 feet from the door, and the driver was back in his seat. I remember looking at him and saying something like, "Wow, you moved fast." And he gave me this confused look and said, "What are you talking about?" I told him I figured he must have knocked and then hurried back to the car. But he just shook his head and said, "No, I didn't knock. I was actually about to call and let you know I was here." I asked him if he was serious. Then I asked him again. I even asked if someone else had been standing nearby and knocked instead. He said no. He told me he'd been sitting there alone for at least a minute and hadn't seen anyone near the entrance. I knew the driver pretty well, and he was not the kind of person who'd play around with something like that. Darren and I just stood there staring at each other because we had both heard it. Clear as day, Not a creak, not some vague sound. A knock, firm and unmistakable, and we were right by the door. We would have seen someone if anyone had actually been there. After Darren left, I had to go back inside and finish closing on my own, and I'm not going to pretend I was calm about it. I was rattled. My nerves were already shot because that wasn't even the first strange thing I'd experienced working there. I tried to push through and finish as fast as I could. I went into the kitchen to make sure everything was off and cleaned down. I'd only been in there maybe 20 seconds when I heard the sound of bar stools scraping across the floor. It's such a specific sound. If you've worked in a bar long enough, you know it instantly. There was no confusing it with anything else. I just froze. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. And for a second, I honestly hoped maybe someone had passed out in a corner somewhere and stumbled out after I thought the place was empty, because that would have been easier to explain. But when I finally forced myself to step out of the kitchen a few seconds later, there was no one there. And the strangest part was that none of the stools had moved. I had lined them all up earlier, neatly, exactly where they should be. Everything looked untouched. That was the moment I really lost my nerve. I didn't want to stay in that building another second by myself. I left, picked up a coworker, and brought her back with me just so I could finish closing without being alone. I've worked at that bar for over 2 years now, and I can tell you this was not the first time something happened that I couldn't explain. There have been a lot of moments there, some small enough to brush off, others that genuinely scared me. I'd probably tell myself it was stress or imagination if it had only happened to me, but it hasn't. Other employees have seen things too. Sometimes other people are standing right there with me when something strange happens. And I guess that's what stays with me the most. It's not just that the building is old, or eerie, or full of stories. It's that every now and then, it feels like something inside it wants to be noticed. So this happened around 8 or 9 years ago, when I was living with my dad in a small 2-bedroom apartment. My room was connected to the bathroom, and that setup always felt a little strange. There were 2 doors into the bathroom. One opened from the main part of the apartment, right near the front entrance, and the other connected directly to my bedroom. The only good thing about that second door was that the lock was on my side. Past the living room, there was a short hallway that led back to my dad's bedroom. We'd already been living there for well over a year, and nothing unusual had ever happened. I already believed in the supernatural back then, mostly because just about everyone in my family had their own stories. They had all seen or heard things in another apartment they lived in before I was born. I believed them, but until this night, I had never experienced anything myself. It was late. Definitely after midnight. I was sitting in a chair in my room, playing video games, facing the TV. I was maybe 5 feet from my open bedroom doorway. My dad had gone to sleep hours earlier, and every light in the apartment was off. It was just the 2 of us there. The only light in my room came from the TV and this standing fan I had, which had a few little blue indicator lights glowing on it. The bathroom door that opened into the main apartment was cracked open, but the bathroom door connected to my room was shut. I remember being very grateful for that. Everything was completely quiet because I was trying not to wake my dad. Then, all at once, I felt movement off to my right, just outside my bedroom door. I didn't hear footsteps or anything at all, but I felt it strongly enough that I turned to look. And right as I turned, I saw it. I saw the forearm and hand of someone, like they were mid-step, walking past my doorway and into the bathroom. I couldn't make out a face or a full body, just that arm and hand moving naturally like a person in motion. Their skin looked dark, and the blue light from my fan caught on it just enough for me to see it clearly. But there was no sound. No footsteps, no rustle, nothing. And when whatever it was went into the bathroom, there was still nothing. No light came on, no door moved, no noise at all. I remember calling out, really uncertain, "Dad?" No answer. The bathroom door stayed open. Everything stayed silent. I just sat there, staring at the doorway, frozen. It felt like 5 full minutes, though it probably couldn't have been more than a few seconds. Every hair on my body stood straight up. Even now, thinking about it gives me chills. Then survival instinct kicked in. I jumped up, slammed my bedroom door shut, locked it, and ran straight to the other door, the one connecting my room to the bathroom, and locked that one too. I did not sleep at all that night, not even for a minute. This happened around 16 years ago, and I still remember it with that strange, heavy clarity some nights leave behind. My grandmother, May, had reached a point where she needed full-time care, and she moved into a nursing home at 92. Even though we knew it was the right decision, it was heartbreaking. She was never going back to her house, so a few months later I went back to my hometown for several days to help my mom sort through everything and get the place ready to sell. I'd spent so much of my childhood at Grandma May's house that being there still felt natural to me. Familiar, even comforting. So I brought my 2 cats along and stayed there while we worked. I set us up in a small bedroom at the top of the stairs on the 2nd floor, mostly because it was one of the least cluttered rooms, and the cats could relax there while Mom and I tackled the rest of the house. We spent 2 full days going through drawers, closets, boxes, old furniture. All the quiet little pieces of a life lived in one place for decades. By the end of the 2nd day, I was completely worn out. Mom headed home for the night, and I went upstairs, sat with my cats for a bit, turned off the light, and fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a huge bang. The kind of sound that makes your whole body snap awake before your mind has time to catch up. It sounded like wood hitting wood downstairs, like a heavy chair or table had slammed into something. At first, I thought I should get up and check it out. But then, right after that bang, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. The stairs were right beside the wall my bed was against, so I could hear them clearly. Slow, deliberate steps, coming all the way up. Then they stopped just outside the bedroom door. And then there were 3 light knocks. I was instantly terrified. I remember lying there in the dark, barely breathing, and calling out as steadily as I could. "Hello? Who's there?" No answer. For a second, I tried to convince myself I'd dreamed it, that maybe I was still half asleep and none of it had really happened. The light switch was just above my head, so I reached up and turned it on. I expected my cats to be groggy or annoyed at me for waking them. Instead, both of them were sitting close together, shoulder to shoulder, staring straight at the bedroom door with their eyes wide open, not looking at me at all. Just fixed on that door. That was the moment I knew I hadn't imagined anything. And honestly, that was not the confirmation I wanted. My phone was charging in another room because my cats were young then and had a talent for knocking cords loose. So there I was, stuck upstairs, looking at 2 cats who were clearly just as uneasy as I was. I called to them a couple of times. They'd glance back at me, then turn right back to the door, like they knew something was there but had no intention of getting any closer. I sat there for a minute, trying to gather myself. Then I thought, I can't stay frozen in this room all night. So I got out of bed, walked to the door, and called out one more time. "Is anyone there?" Nothing. I opened the door, and I can tell you this, there are few things more unnerving than opening a door when your whole mind is braced to find someone standing on the other side, and there's just no one there. I checked the entire house, every room, every corner. It was a 4-bedroom place, and I went through all of it. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had fallen over. The outside doors were still locked. There was no sign that anyone had been inside at all. Eventually, I went back upstairs and got back into bed. People always ask me how I managed to sleep after that. And the truth is, I think the fear burned through me so hard that once it let go, I just crashed. Pure adrenaline and exhaustion. Nothing else happened the rest of the night. The next morning, Mom came over with breakfast, and while we were getting ready to start another long day of sorting through things, I told her everything. I was expecting her to smile politely and tell me I'd been overtired. Instead, she said, very calmly, "When we visit Grandma today, you should tell her that story." I laughed and said, "Why? So she can make fun of me?" Mom just said, "No, just tell her." That got my attention. So later that day, we went to see Grandma May. We sat and talked for a while, just chatting, and then Mom turned to her and said, "Mom, Rowan has something to tell you about last night." The second Mom said it, I could tell by her tone that this wasn't random. Grandma looked right at me, and I started explaining what had happened. I barely got to the part where I said, "I woke up to this really loud sound," before she interrupted me and said, "Wood slamming into wood?" I just stared at her. Then she asked, "Did you see him?" And I said, "See who?" She answered, "The old man in the overalls." I remember looking from Grandma to Mom and back again, completely stunned. And that was when they finally told me that Grandma had experienced things in that house for years. Not just odd noises, but full-body apparitions, footsteps, figures, strange moments that had become almost familiar to her. She even told me that once she'd seen the old man and followed him toward the bathroom, asking where he was going. He told her, "To fix the car." She said she told him there wasn't any car in the bathroom, but he walked in anyway and disappeared. Grandma had kept most of it to herself because she didn't want people thinking she'd lost her mind. A few days later, more family came to help finish clearing out the house, and I told the story again. That's when my uncles started sharing their own memories. Shadowy figures upstairs, strange shapes in the hallway. My younger uncle said he used to sleep on the couch because being upstairs at night unsettled him so badly. What gets me is that I stayed in that house all the time when I was a kid. Weekends, holidays, random visits, you name it. And I never had a single paranormal experience there. Not one. So part of me has always wondered if whatever was in that house waited until I was older. Or maybe it was because Grandma had been gone for a while, and I was suddenly there in her place, moving through the rooms, sorting through her things, changing the rhythm of the house. Maybe something noticed. Maybe it wanted to know who I was. The house was sold years ago, and as far as I know, it's still standing. And I'll be honest with you, I've often wondered whether the people living there now have stories of their own. Because after that night, I have a hard time believing I was the last one to hear footsteps on those stairs. So let me tell you something that still sits in the back of my mind like a splinter I can never quite pull out. This happened about 9 years ago, just before I moved away for college. Back then, my boyfriend, 2 close friends, and I used to drive from Chicago up to Milwaukee pretty often for EDM shows on the weekends. It felt normal then, you know? We were young, broke, always a little reckless, and absolutely convinced that being tired was the same thing as being invincible. On this particular Friday, I drove us up after class. We got there sometime around early evening, maybe a little after 6, and we left the venue before midnight. Usually, on trips like that, we'd figure out a place to stay. Nothing fancy, just enough to sleep for a few hours before heading back. But that night, for whatever reason, We decided not to get a hotel. I think part of it was money, part of it was us being dumb and overconfident, and part of it was just assuming we'd figure it out. Our brilliant plan was to nap in my car for a bit and then drive home. The problem was, there really was not a safe or comfortable place to do that. We spent what felt like forever trying to make it work, moving the seats around, cracking windows, talking ourselves into being able to sleep, but nobody really could. So sometime in the middle of the night, maybe around 2:30 or 3, we gave up and decided to head back to Chicago instead. The plan was that I'd drive part of the way, then we'd switch off. My boyfriend at the time, I'll call him Mason, was going to take over for the second half. We made a couple stops, switched drivers once or twice, grabbed gas not too far outside the city, and eventually got back to Chicago. We parked outside Mason's apartment building just before dawn, maybe around 4:30 or so. At that point, all four of us were exhausted, but not ready to get out of the car yet. We started passing around my phone, looking through concert videos and blurry photos, laughing at how bad some of them were, replaying little moments from the night. And then came the part that changed everything. While we were all huddled over my phone watching a video, someone knocked on the window. It scared all of us half to death. It was Mason's mom. She worked nights, so seeing her out there in the dark made sense at first. She looked at us, kind of puzzled but calm, and asked how the concert was, how the drive back went, whether we were hungry or tired. We told her, yeah, we were wiped out. Then she asked, almost casually, why we'd stayed in the car so long. Mason shrugged and said we were just looking through pictures and videos from the concert. And I still remember what she said next. She looked at us and said, "Did it really take you 2 days to look at pictures and videos?" At first, none of us even understood what she meant. We asked her what she was talking about, and she said, completely seriously, "You guys have been out here since Friday night. It's Sunday evening." I cannot properly describe the feeling that hit that car. It was instant panic. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just pure confusion. All four of us started talking over each other, asking her the same questions in different ways, hoping one of them would somehow crack the whole thing open and make it make sense. Why hadn't she said something earlier? She told us she'd noticed my car when she left for work Saturday night, but she assumed we'd parked it there and gone inside somewhere, maybe to his apartment or maybe somewhere else. It wasn't until she saw the car was still there the next day that she came over to check. But then there were all these other details, and none of them made sense either. My car still had gas. Not empty, not even close. I'd filled up less than an hour outside Chicago, and somehow the tank was still around 3/4 full. That alone still bothers me. If the engine had been running all that time, especially with the air going, how was there any gas left? None of us remembered falling asleep. And even if we had, how do 4 people all stay asleep that long in a car without waking up hungry, thirsty, sore, confused, needing a bathroom, anything? Not one of us got out. Not one of us ate or drank. Our 2 friends had their own cars parked nearby, so if they'd wanted to leave, they could have. But nobody did. I also didn't have frantic missed calls from my parents. They weren't strict, and they gave me space, but still, 2 full days? You'd think there would have been something. After we all kind of spiraled for a while in front of Mason's building, our friends finally left. Mason and I drove to my parents' house, which was only about 15 minutes away. By then, it was around 10 o'clock on Sunday night. We tried to explain what had happened, and my parents didn't believe me at all. I think they assumed I was making up some ridiculous story to cover for being somewhere else, even though I wasn't. And honestly, I get why it sounded unbelievable. But the strangest part is this. All four of us were so shaken by it that we basically never talked about it again. Not really. It was like we had all silently agreed that if we left it alone, maybe it would stay buried. It didn't. I still think about it, more than I probably should. I still run through every normal explanation I can think of, trying to force it into something logical. Did we all somehow pass out? Was there something wrong with us physically? Did exhaustion do something bizarre to our sense of time? Was it some shared blackout, some strange psychological thing, some medical explanation nobody caught? Or was it something I still don't have words for? I know how this sounds when I say it out loud, but I'm telling you exactly the way I remember it, and that's what unsettles me most. It doesn't feel like a dream. It doesn't feel fuzzy. It feels real. Just impossible. And even now, part of me still wants to call those three people and ask, do you still think about that weekend too? Or am I the only one still haunted by it? It was last July, close to 11 at night, and Mara and I had just left his place after finishing a long game of Monopoly. He was staying at his grandparents' old house in a quiet subdivision, and I was driving us back to my place. I remember pulling up to the exit, getting ready to turn onto the main road, doing the usual thing, checking left, then right. But when I snapped my head back to the left, I froze. There was this glowing white figure standing right in the middle of the road. It was maybe 50 feet ahead of us. Human-shaped, about the size of a person, but there was no face, no real features, nothing I could make out clearly. It was just this bright white shape, almost like it was lit from within. And then, in a split second, it lifted what looked like an arm and shot straight upward, maybe 15 or 20 feet, and vanished. Just gone. Completely gone. It only lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was long enough for me to know I saw something. There weren't any cars coming, it was dark, and there was nothing around that could have caused some kind of reflection. I just sat there for a second and asked Mara, "Did you just see what I think I saw?" And he got quiet and said, "Yeah, I did. I just didn't want to be the first one to say it." That part still gets me, because if it had only been me, I probably would have spent years trying to explain it away. And honestly, what we saw that night felt even stranger because of everything that had already been happening in that house. Even though the house itself wasn't very old, it always felt wrong in there. Heavy, like the air had weight to it, like somebody was watching you constantly, especially after dark. You know that feeling when it seems like someone is standing just behind you, close enough that you should be able to hear them breathe? That's what it felt like almost every night. We used to hear whispering too. Really low, constant chatter, like people talking in the next room, except whenever we stopped and listened, we could never make out a single word. Mara said he would hear growling sometimes, just out of nowhere. One night, both of us heard this long, loud moan in the hallway outside the bedroom. It sounded like a woman, and it was close enough that neither of us slept after that. We each had a child, and one morning around 6, we woke up to 3 clear knocks on the bedroom door. I thought one of the kids had gotten up early, so I opened the door and checked the living room. Both of them were still asleep on the couch. Nobody else was there. Another time, from the bedroom, we heard what sounded like papers being thrown around the kitchen, drawers opening and slamming. It was so loud and sudden that I actually jumped up and unlocked the sliding glass door in the bedroom because I thought someone had broken into the house and we'd need a way out fast. But when we checked, nobody was there, just drawers standing open. Mara also told me that one night he walked out of the bedroom and saw a tall black figure near the kitchen. He said it sort of stepped out from the darkness and then disappeared right in front of him. It all got so intense that we started making a habit of leaving before it got dark, and staying at my place instead. And that was exactly why we were leaving that night after Monopoly. We'd looked at the time, realized how late it was, and basically rushed out of there because neither of us wanted to spend another night in that house. What makes it even stranger is that his grandmother, before she moved out, used to insist that people were living in the attic or the basement. She called the police more than once, convinced there were squatters in the house, but nobody ever found anything. Later on, when we were trying to make sense of everything, Mara remembered that during the last couple of years she lived there, she had gotten deeply into tarot readings on TV and was watching them constantly, all day and half the night, almost like she was letting them dictate her life. I don't know whether that had anything to do with what was in that house. I really can't say. I just know that the feeling there was real, the sounds were real, and whatever we saw in the road that night, both of us saw it. And I still have no idea what it was. This happened in 2000, and I still swear every word of it is true. At the time, my first wife and I had separated, and we were in the middle of a divorce. I was living by myself in the house we'd shared, and to be honest, it was a lonely, heavy sort of season. One night, I went out for drinks with a couple of friends and made it home sometime around 2 in the morning. I'd had more than enough, and when I got back, the house was completely quiet. I turned on the television, dropped into my old armchair, and lit a cigarette. I must have drifted off without realizing it. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this voice explode right beside my ear, on my right side. It shouted, "Wake up!" I'm telling you, it wasn't like hearing someone call from across the room. It felt close, immediate, powerful. I jumped straight out of that chair in total confusion, half asleep and panicking, trying to figure out who on earth had spoken. And then I felt the heat. While I'd been dozing, the cigarette had slipped from my hand and fallen onto my chest. It had been burning into my jumper, smoldering away until the fabric had just started to catch fire. I slapped at the flames, yanked the jumper off, and then rushed through the entire house, room by room, convinced someone had to be there. But there was nobody. I was completely alone. Eventually, I came back to the living room, still shaken, my heart pounding. The smell of smoke was hanging in the air, and there on the floor was the cigarette, beside my scorched, ruined jumper. Everything about it was real, plain as day. But the voice, that was the part I couldn't explain. Even now, I can still hear it in my mind, and it still gives me chills. The way I describe it never quite captures it properly. It started low, almost like a deep rumble, and then built into something forceful and commanding, until it hit with this overwhelming urgency. I don't like to think too much about what could have happened if it hadn't woken me. Up until then, I'd always thought of myself as a practical, level-headed skeptic. But after that night, I became much more open to the idea that there may be things in this world we simply can't explain. There's one more detail I always feel is worth mentioning. My father had died of cancer only a few months before this happened. I can't say it was him. I honestly don't know, but I can't help noting it. My dad, Raymond, had spent many years as an army sergeant. He never once raised his voice at me, not in all the years I knew him. But I knew from others that he was deeply respected, and when he spoke, people listened. So no, I'm not saying it was him, but I've never forgotten that voice. I've only really been living in this apartment for about a week, even though I got the place nearly 2 months ago. It's part of this big old Spanish-style house from the late 1800s, split up into several units now. Mine is upstairs. The whole place has that older layout where every room leads into another room with its own door, instead of one big open space. It feels beautiful, but also a little closed in at night. Almost every night this past week, something strange has been happening between midnight and 3 in the morning. The first time I heard it, it sounded like someone stomping twice with the heel of a shoe. Not loudly, but enough to make me freeze. Then it kept happening for maybe 15 minutes, slightly off rhythm, like someone trying to keep a beat and failing. I got so scared I reached over to wake my boyfriend, but the second I said something out loud, it stopped. Just completely stopped. I stayed awake for another half hour waiting for it to start again, but it never did. When I checked my phone, it was exactly 3 a.m. Another night, I heard this strange movement from the same part of the apartment. The best way I can describe it is that it sounded like some medium-sized animal shifting around, but when I got up to look, there was nothing there. Then one afternoon, I'd fallen asleep on the couch in the living room while my boyfriend was in bed with our dog. I didn't hear anything that time, but the next day he told me he'd heard light footsteps in the hallway. At first he thought it was our dog, who's about 20 pounds, but when he lifted his head, the dog was curled up in the corner of the room, already awake, staring toward the hallway. Then the footsteps came again, quick and light. Our dog got stiff, started growling toward the hall, and then everything went silent. The next day, when he told me all this, I honestly felt sick. Ghosts have always terrified me. I've had experiences before that I still don't like thinking about, so this is pretty much one of my worst fears. We ended up going out for coffee mostly just to get out of the apartment for a while, and I started pressing him for details. I asked what the footsteps sounded like, where they seemed to be coming from, how heavy they were. He didn't really want to say it, but finally he admitted he thought it might be a young boy. When I asked why, he told me he'd actually been noticing strange things ever since he moved in about a month earlier. He just hadn't wanted to scare me. He said there had been noises at night more than once. Footsteps, little sounds, things he couldn't explain. One night, he was sleeping on the couch during this awful heat wave when it had been over 100 degrees every day, and since the apartment has no air conditioning, it was miserable inside. He woke up around 2 a.m. because he felt like someone was watching him. And even though it had been unbearably hot, the room had turned cold. He didn't see anyone, but he said he felt something there with him. He told me he thought it was a child because whatever presence he sensed felt short, and the footsteps sounded small, like a kid pacing through the hallway. Then last night, things got even harder to brush off. We were sitting in the living room watching TV around midnight when the nightlight in the kitchen started flickering. Not just once or twice, but on and off for 10 straight minutes. I finally said out loud, "Please stop." And it did, immediately. We went to bed around 1 a.m., and not long after that, I heard this scuttling sound behind the hallway door that leads toward the kitchen. My bedroom itself doesn't have its own door, but there's a short hallway attached to it, and that hallway does. My dog suddenly jumped off the bed, ran straight to the door, and started barking. We called him back, and by then the noise had stopped again. I was so shaken that I barely slept. I kept drifting off and waking back up, and every time I started to relax, I'd hear something again from behind that door. My boyfriend left early this morning, around 6, for a long drive, and that was the only time I managed to finally fall asleep. When I woke up around 9, I noticed my closet door was standing open. So was the hallway closet. I still haven't asked him yet if he opened them before he left. I really, really hope he did. Before I get into the strange part, I should say this first. I was incredibly close with my grandmother, Mara. We spent so much time together, especially in the last few years of her life. Then I went overseas for 6 months, and she passed away just days before I was supposed to come home. When I finally got back, it was late, around 2 in the morning. The airport was closer to my grandmother's house than my own place, so I stayed there that first night. My sister, Elise, her husband, and their baby were there too because of the funeral. The service had already happened, but they had delayed the burial so I could be there. I had been traveling for more than a full day, and I was completely wiped out. I went straight upstairs, dropped my bags, and fell asleep almost immediately. I didn't wake up until well into the afternoon. Upstairs, the house had this long hallway layout. There were 2 bedrooms on either side of the stairs, and then one more room at the very end of the hall. Elise and her family were staying in the room on the left, and I was in the room at the end. When I finally came downstairs, my brother-in-law looked at me and said, "You're up early." I remember staring at him, confused, and saying, "What are you talking about? I haven't been out of that room since I got here." He said that earlier that morning, he'd heard someone downstairs in the kitchen, moving around, opening things, just making the kind of sounds a person makes when they're awake before everyone else. Since Elise was still in bed next to him, he assumed it had to be me. I didn't think much of it at first. The house was old, full of creaks and settling noises, and I was too tired to read into it. But then Elise spoke up. She told me she'd been awake very early to feed the baby, and while she was up, she heard movement in the hallway. She thought it was me too, so she stepped out, expecting to see me there. Instead, she said she saw something she still couldn't really explain. She called it a shadowy glow, which honestly sounded odd to me too, but that was the phrase she used. She said it moved quietly down the hallway and toward the room where I was sleeping. My door had been closed, so she said it just seemed to fade when it reached it. I got emotional right away. And then Elise looked at me and said, very gently, "I think that was Grandma saying goodbye to you." The reason that hit me so hard is because my last real moment with my grandmother hadn't been peaceful. I'd seen her in the hospital during a visit home, and it was painful, messy, heartbreaking. It wasn't the memory I wanted to carry forever. So maybe my sister was half awake and imagined it. Maybe my brother-in-law heard an old house shifting in the night. Maybe there's a perfectly ordinary explanation for all of it. But in my heart, I choose to believe she came back one last time so I wouldn't leave this world with only that hospital memory. I believe she came to say goodbye. After the burial, I went back to my own apartment, but Elise and her husband stayed at the house for a couple more nights. They told me nothing else happened after that. No footsteps, no sounds in the kitchen, no strange glow in the hallway, just silence. The house was sold not long after, and I never got to go back. But maybe that was enough. Maybe she only needed one quiet moment to let me know she hadn't left without me. I work in a dental practice that's spread across 3 floors, and lately, a few things have happened that none of us can quite explain. On the ground floor, we've got reception, a couple of waiting areas, and 2 treatment rooms. The middle floor has another surgery and the decontamination room. Upstairs is where the staff area is, with the kitchen, bathroom, changing room, and a little space where we sit on our breaks. The building is always locked, and only staff have keys, so we're usually very aware of exactly who's inside at any time. One afternoon, I was down in the decontamination room around lunch, and the only other person in the practice with me was my colleague, Mara. She's the kind of person who never believes in anything paranormal, not even a little bit. I was standing by the window, absent-mindedly watching the cars leaving the car park, when Mara started walking in to ask if I was heading for lunch. Just as she reached the doorway, she heard this low groan right beside her shoulder. She turned to me straight away and asked if I was messing around or making strange noises, but I hadn't said a word. She even said it felt like it came from behind her, not from where I was standing. We laughed it off at the time, but it definitely stuck with us. Then, a few days later, almost all of us were upstairs in the kitchen having lunch. One of our other colleagues, Nina, was still downstairs on reception because she was taking her break later. We were all chatting normally when suddenly we heard someone scream, "Help!" It was so sharp and panicked that every one of us froze. And the strangest part was, it sounded exactly like Nina. Not vaguely like her, but exactly like her. Then it came again, and again. In total, we heard it 5 times, each one urgent and desperate. We all looked at each other, realized we'd all heard the same thing, and ran straight downstairs. When we reached reception, Nina was completely fine, calm, confused, and very much not calling for help. She said she hadn't shouted, hadn't heard anything, and there was no one else in the building. What makes it even stranger is that if the voice had come from outside, she should have heard it more clearly than any of us. But she heard absolutely nothing. We tried to brush that off too, even though it shook all of us a bit. Later, I mentioned it to another colleague who'd been off that day. She told me something she'd seen earlier that same week. She'd arrived very early one morning, just as it was getting light. It was that gray winter kind of morning, where you can still tell the darkness hasn't fully lifted. We sometimes arrive while the cleaners are still there, so she looked up at the windows before getting out of her car to see if anyone was inside. The lights were off, the front gates were padlocked, and there were no cars parked outside, so she assumed the cleaners had already gone. But then, she saw someone standing at the middle floor window, looking out. She said what unsettled her most was that the figure didn't look like a person in shadow. The daylight was strong enough that she should have been able to make out a face or some kind of detail. Instead, it was just a solid dark shape, like a black outline filled in completely. No features, no movement. Just watching from the exact same floor where Mara had heard that groan behind her. Then later that same day, one of our last patients had put his things on a countertop while I was nearby typing up notes. Something suddenly dropped onto the floor. He picked it up, set it back, and a few minutes later it fell again. Then it happened another time. After the 3rd or 4th time, I laughed and said, "Your things really don't want to stay there, do they?" And he smiled and said, "Must be your practice ghost." I remember going cold when he said it, because that room was on the middle floor too, and by then all of us had started quietly noticing the same pattern. Whatever was happening in that building, it always seemed to come back to the middle floor. You know, when I was younger, my family moved into this incredible old California house that felt like it had been built for parties and long summer nights. It had these huge, perfectly kept gardens, little fountains tucked here and there, an open atrium, and this enormous pool with a patio that seemed to go on forever. Out on the property, a little way from the main house, there was also a manufactured guest house. It was maybe 8 or 12 years old at the time, around 500 square feet, and the previous owners had apparently used it for an older relative. When we first bought the place, my dad checked it over, locked it up, and more or less forgot about it. Inside, it had a small kitchenette, a full bathroom, and a washer and dryer that still looked fairly new. No furniture, no decorations, nothing. Just empty rooms. We lived way up on a hill back then, and there really was not anyone nearby. No close neighbors, no foot traffic, nothing. There was one other house farther down the road, but it was empty and had been sitting on the market for a while. Then, one summer night, our washer in the main house quit working. And with a family that big, laundry does not politely wait for a repair appointment. So my dad decided to carry a load down to that little guest house and use the washing machine there. It was an older, top-loading whirlpool, the kind with the heavy lid. He started the load, stood there for a minute to make sure it was running properly, and then headed back up to the house. But when he came back later, the lid was standing open and the clothes were everywhere. Not just spilled out near the machine, but scattered across the floor like somebody had grabbed them and flung them around. At first he thought maybe the washer had somehow malfunctioned, but that did not really explain how the clothes had ended up so far from it. That was the moment he got uneasy. My dad was a Vietnam combat veteran, and he was not the kind of man who spooked easily. He had a sidearm on him, so he searched around the guest house, checking corners and looking outside, thinking maybe somebody had gotten in somehow. He did not find anyone. So he picked up all the clothes, loaded them back into the washer, and started it again. This time, he stayed there the whole cycle. Nothing happened. The machine worked perfectly. He brought that load back to the main house to dry it, then took another batch down, and when he returned again, same thing. Clothes all over the floor. That was when he said every hair on his arms stood up. Now he was genuinely shaken. But he also had an idea. We had this huge German shepherd named Baron, and my dad figured that if someone was sneaking into the guest house to mess with him, the dog would catch it instantly. So he brought Baron down with him. But the second they got close to the door, Baron stopped cold. Just planted himself. Then he started whining. My dad tried to lead him forward, and the dog absolutely refused. He was straining backward, barking, crying, fighting with everything he had not to go through that doorway. My dad eventually managed to get him inside, but Baron completely lost it. He would not settle down. He just kept barking and whining like something in there had terrified him. After that, my dad gave up. He grabbed the laundry and went back to the house, and we did not try using that washer again. We waited until someone came out and fixed ours. What made it stranger was that Baron was always alert. He had this long dog run that let him roam a good stretch of the yard, close enough that he would have noticed anyone coming or going near that guest house. But he never once barked at that building before or after. Never gave us any sign that a person had been around. That house is still out there, up on a hill not far outside Lockford, behind a gate. And to this day, we never found out anything about the history of that property. We never learned whether something bad had happened there. But I can tell you this. My dad never forgot what happened in that little guest house. And honestly, neither did the rest of us. Hey everyone, welcome back to Paranormal M channel. How's your day been? Still having trouble falling asleep? Let us help you unwind and drift off by listening to some paranormal stories together. And thank you so much for sending in your personal paranormal experiences. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to catch new videos on the channel. Now go ahead and get comfy in bed, snuggle up under your blankets, put on your headphones, and lose yourself in today's paranormal stories. I need to tell you about something that happened to me that I still can't fully explain. Before any of it started, I'd already been awake for nearly 2 days. I met up with a friend, we went out, and we drank way too much. I'm talking full blackout. At one point, I fell into a small wooden table and smashed the area around my brows on both sides. I also had a sore spot near my right temple afterward, so I wasn't exactly in great shape. After that, everything turned into a mess. On my way back, I got stranded because the ride had been sent to the wrong location, and the buses weren't running for hours. So I spent the rest of the night wandering around half lost, exhausted, trying to get myself back to the city. Eventually, I made it to a bus stop, waited forever, and finally got home. By then, I was sobering up, just completely drained. Later that night, I still couldn't sleep. I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, stuck in my own head. I felt awful about how the whole night had gone. I was embarrassed, disappointed in myself, and replaying everything. My friend, whose name is Mason, had ended up getting kicked out of his hostel because of the damage I caused, and he had to sleep in his car. That part really got to me. By around 4 in the morning, I knew I had to at least try to sleep. So I put my phone down, closed my eyes, and almost immediately, the darkness changed. Instead of just blackness, I started seeing these vibrating lines, like a strange electric fuzz. Then it began to form into what looked like the inside of a building. The only way I can describe it is that it felt like some grand stone hall from another world, almost ancient but somehow futuristic too. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's honestly what it looked like. I remember thinking, okay, I'm hallucinating. That has never happened to me before, but in that moment I was weirdly calm about it. I just watched. Then, a figure appeared. It looked human, but not fully solid. More like it was made of colored light, almost like TV static mixed with rainbow tones. It was standing right where my bed was, except it seemed to float through the space instead of touching anything. What really got me was that when I moved my head, it didn't disappear. The figure stayed exactly where it was, and so did the whole scene around it. It felt less like I was imagining something, and more like I was seeing into another place. The figure started moving its arms up and down, almost like it was trying to get my attention. My heart was pounding. I was amazed and terrified at the same time. I kept thinking, what is happening right now? Is this some kind of spirit? Some kind of being? It all felt way too real. Then, it started walking toward me. That's when I panicked. I jolted upright, shouting and swearing, completely freaked out. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on straight away because I was honestly scared out of my mind. I sat there for a minute trying to calm myself down, telling myself maybe it had just been some kind of dream or strange half-awake state. But I didn't feel asleep. I felt awake, just shaken and sort of trapped in this strange trance. Then, I noticed something in the room. There was this patch of light hanging in the darkness. Not on the wall, not reflecting off anything, just suspended there in space. When I pointed my flashlight toward it, it would seem to fade, but when I lowered the light, it would come back. At first, it looked like a soft, floating glow, about the size of an orange. No sharp edges, just this dim little cloud of light moving around the room. But then, it changed. It started to look like a hand. It went on for several minutes, though it felt much longer. At that point, I completely lost it and started calling my mom over and over until she answered. I woke her up and told her she had to stay on the phone with me because I was terrified. I explained everything as it was happening, and she said I sounded clear and aware, just shocked and frightened. I was literally describing the thing while watching it move. I eventually hung up because I wanted to try recording it. I did get a video, but it's incredibly hard to see anything on it. You really have to look closely. I remember noticing the movement most near the top of the frame. You can believe me or not, that's up to you. I know how unbelievable it sounds. But I'm not making this up, and I know what I saw. What stays with me most isn't even the fear. Yes, I was scared in the moment, really scared. But underneath that, there was also this strange sense of awe. And afterward, this deep calm. Looking back on it now, the whole thing feels less threatening and more meaningful somehow. I still don't know whether what I saw was something caused by exhaustion, alcohol, the injury, or something spiritual, something other. I honestly can't tell you. I just know that for a few minutes that night, it felt like something reached through the dark and let me see it. I didn't hear most of these stories until after my wife's family had already moved out, which honestly made it even stranger to learn about later. For a while, my wife's younger brother was staying with us, and so was her sister and her husband. After they left, I found out they'd both had some unsettling experiences in our apartment. My brother-in-law used to sleep in one of the spare rooms, and he told us he would sometimes wake up and see these dark, shadowy shapes in the room while he was lying in bed. One time, it happened 3 nights in a row. By the 3rd night, he got so fed up that he actually shouted at whatever it was, telling it to leave him alone. My sister-in-law had even more disturbing experiences. Her husband worked changing shifts, so he'd often leave very early, sometimes before sunrise. One morning, after he had already gone to work, she was still lying in bed when she felt the mattress dip, like someone had just climbed in beside her. Naturally, she turned over, expecting to see her husband, but instead, she was faced with something that only looked like him. Another time, again after he'd already left for work, she said something that appeared to be him grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her right out of bed. We're Muslim, and from what we've been taught, experiences like this are often connected to jinn, beings that can take on different forms. I can't explain why it seemed to focus on my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, or why it was especially aggressive toward her. What I do know is that after they moved out, neither of them ever reported anything like that again. These days, it's just me, my wife, our son, and our daughter living here. About a year ago, my son started acting nervous in ways that stood out to me. Every evening before sunset, he'd make sure the outside doors and windows were shut, and if he noticed a dark room with the door cracked open, he'd go close it right away. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off and said he just didn't like the dark. Later, my wife told me something he had asked her that he never said to me. He wanted to know if someone had been in his room while he was sleeping. He sleeps in the same room my brother-in-law used to use. One night, he woke up on the top bunk and looked toward the mirror. In the reflection, he thought he saw the outline of someone lying in the bottom bunk. Since then, he's gone back to acting like himself, and as far as I know, he hasn't seen anything else. My wife and daughter have never mentioned seeing anything unusual either. As for me, I've heard things. Every now and then, I'll hear a whisper somewhere in the apartment. It's always quick, too quick to make out clearly. The best way I can describe it is like someone passes by me in a hurry and, without stopping, leans close enough to whisper a single word into my ear before moving on. A few weeks ago, I was taking an afternoon nap in my room while the kids were out in the living room playing video games. I was dreaming, though I can't remember what about. In the middle of it, I felt like something whispered to me the same way I sometimes hear around the house, and it startled me awake. After a little while, I drifted off again, and it happened a second time, then a third. Since then, everything has been quiet again, but I still think about it. Because when something happens once, you can dismiss it. When it keeps happening in different ways, to different people, in the same place, that's a lot harder to ignore. I want to tell you something I've carried with me for most of my life, and I know how strange it sounds, but I also know what I experienced. I wasn't covering for something else, and I wasn't confused. The fear I felt was real, and it stayed with me for years. This started when I was very young, maybe 6 or 7. Back then, my family lived in an old house on a quiet street, and that's where it began. I used to see what I can only describe as shadow children. At first, I thought of them almost like playmates because I was a kid and I didn't understand what I was looking at. I'd talk to them, follow them with my eyes, even try to get closer. Meanwhile, my parents just assumed I was downstairs entertaining myself, using my imagination. But these things didn't feel imaginary. It's hard for me to describe what they looked like, because even then, Trying to focus on them felt wrong somehow. Their shapes were there, like darkness had taken on a body, but their faces, or maybe their heads, were the worst part. Every time I tried to really look, it was like my mind slipped. It hurt in a way I still can't fully explain. There's one night I remember more clearly than anything else, and it was the last time I ever saw one. I'd stayed up later than usual. I was exhausted, half awake really, and I remember seeing it standing there in my room. Only this time, it wasn't child-sized. It was taller, full-sized, more like a grown figure made out of shadow. And what still gets to me is that I knew it was aware of me. I knew it was watching. Then it smiled. I can't even say for sure what the smile looked like, whether it was pale or sharp, or just somehow visible against the dark. I only know the feeling it gave me. It looked at me the way a predator looks at something cornered. And after that, something happened. Something in my head. That's the only way I know how to say it. I remember letting out this terrified scream, and then everything just cut. The next thing I knew, I woke up drenched in sweat, tucked neatly into my bed. That alone scared me, because I never slept tucked in like that. My mom didn't do that either, not even when I was little. The next morning, I asked her how I ended up there, and she told me she'd heard me screaming, came into my room, settled me into bed, and let me sleep. Maybe that should have comforted me, but it didn't. It only made the whole thing feel even more real. After that night, I was terrified of the dark for years. Not just as a little kid, but well into my teens. I had to force myself through it slowly. Nightlights, sleeping with doors open, making myself sit in dark rooms until I could breathe normally again. It took a long time. I did eventually get better, but I never went back into that house. Not once. Even now, as an adult, bigger, stronger, confident in most situations, nothing has ever made me feel as helpless as those things did. For a long time, I tried not to think about it too much. I pushed it down and kept moving. Then years later, I found out I wasn't the only one. 2 of my friends told me they'd had experiences with shadow children when they were younger. One of them had even lived on the same block I did. What really shook me was that he brought it up on his own. I hadn't told him anything about what happened to me. He had no reason to say it, no story to match mine, and yet he described the same kind of fear. There's one more part of this that's hard to talk about. Years later, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I know people could easily say the 2 things aren't connected, and maybe they're right. Maybe I would have developed it no matter what. But I didn't have those symptoms when I was a kid, and I still catch myself wondering whether those experiences did something to me. Whether, if they had never happened, my life might have unfolded differently. I try not to live in that question too much. I'm medicated now, I'm stable, and I'm doing okay. But the memories still get under my skin. So that's my story. And if you've ever experienced something similar, shadow children, shadow figures, anything like that, I'd really want to hear it. Even just knowing someone else understands that kind of fear makes it feel a little less lonely. Hi, I'm telling you this because, honestly, I don't really know what else to make of it anymore. I live in a very old family house, one that was built sometime in the 1950s, long before I was born. My great-grandparents built it after they left the countryside and started over in the city. So this place has a lot of history in it, a lot of memories. It's not just a house to us. A few years ago, my grandfather passed away here on the property. Back then, strange little things would happen once in a while. We'd feel a soft breeze move through the room, even when all the windows were shut and the air was completely still. It was unsettling, but never in a harsh way. I guess I convinced myself it was just his presence passing through gently, and that eventually he had found peace. But over the last few years, something else has been happening, and it feels different. Things keep getting misplaced around the house. Small things mostly. Keys, socks, shoes, shirts. Things that don't seem important until you know for a fact you left them somewhere, and then they're suddenly gone. At first, it was easy to brush it off. I thought maybe I was distracted. Maybe someone moved something and forgot. But it's been happening too often now, and for too long, to ignore. My father used to joke about it. He'd say there were little goblins living under the old fig tree in the yard, and whenever something vanished, he'd laugh and say, "There they go again," or blame some ghost in the house. I always laughed with him. It was just family nonsense, you know? The kind of thing people say to make the weirdness feel harmless. But lately, I'm not laughing as much. Just a few nights ago, I found my sleep shirt tucked in with the clothes that were about to be sent to the laundry shop. I know I didn't put it there. I'm absolutely sure of that. And it's not the first time. There have been keys that disappeared from the exact place they were left, clothes that turned up in odd places, and other little things that seemed to drift around the house without explanation. I think I could still force myself to believe I'm imagining all of it, if it weren't for what my dad told me. He said one night he was up late working in the dining room when he saw a figure move past the doorway. He described it as tall, strange, and almost see-through. At first, he assumed it was my mother, just passing by. But then he realized that couldn't be right, because she was already asleep in their room. And besides, she isn't tall. Neither was my grandfather, which makes the whole thing even harder to explain. So now I don't know what to think. For a while, I wondered if it was some mischievous little spirit, like the stories people tell about goblins or hidden beings that like to play tricks. But I have a much younger brother, and in our traditions, that should mean he's protected. So if it isn't something like that, then what is it? And why is it here? That's the part that's been bothering me most. Not just that things are moving, or that someone saw something unexplained, but that this presence doesn't feel familiar. It doesn't feel like my grandfather. It feels like something else, something we don't understand, sharing space with us in silence. And I'm really not sure what I'm supposed to do next. Hey, so I've been a nurse assistant since 2023, and I work in pediatrics. I spend a lot of time caring for other people's kids, and somehow, life brought me into this beautiful, strange little family of my own. My boyfriend and I have a boy we call our son. His name is Gale now. Well, that's the name I'll use here. He's 16. We took him in when he was around 10, not legally, but in every way that matters. His dad had passed away. His biological mother was never really there for him, and over time, he just became ours. He calls us Mom and Dad, and that's exactly what we are to him. A couple years ago, he moved in with my boyfriend after my boyfriend got his own place, and I'm there all the time. In spring of 2025, they moved into a different house, closer to Gale's school and a lot more central than the old place. Right away, one thing stood out. The bathroom smelled awful at random times. Not just bad plumbing bad, something heavy, rotten, hard to explain. My boyfriend even mentioned people never seemed to stay in that house very long. At first, nothing felt obviously wrong. Or maybe it did, and we just brushed it off. Then one night, maybe 6 weeks after they moved in, Gale was sleeping over at a friend's house. It was really late, around 1 in the morning. My boyfriend and I were lying in bed upstairs in the dark. No TV, no lights, both awake but quiet. And all of a sudden, we heard this huge slam from downstairs, like the front door had been thrown open. We both froze. Then we heard footsteps. My boyfriend raised his voice and said something like, "Seriously, kid?" "It's way too late. You had your mom worried." He said it like Gail had just come home and was about to get lectured. But we both knew Gail wasn't coming back that night. He was trying to make it known that somebody was in the house and that they weren't alone. And then, the front door closed again. Softly. That was it. After that, things started happening more often. One day I was home alone before a night shift. I had cleaned up, made the bed, straightened everything. Later, when my boyfriend came home with Gail, the bed looked wrong. The blankets had been disturbed, like someone had laid down for a while and then gotten up. It wasn't me. From that point on, little things kept shifting around the house. Nothing was ever stolen. No money missing, no food disappearing, nothing like that. Things just moved. At first, we really tried to tell ourselves it had to be a person. Maybe the landlord had a spare key. Maybe someone was sneaking in. We clung to that explanation for months because it felt safer than the alternative. But it stopped making sense. Why would anyone come in so often just to move things around and leave? Then came the night that changed everything. We had dinner and gone upstairs to bed. Our room was upstairs. Gail's was downstairs. He wasn't tired yet and said he wanted to watch a movie with us later. Very teenager style, he said, "Give me like an hour. I'm doing something." I remember seeing him put his headphones on and head toward the bathroom. I went upstairs and got into bed with my phone. My boyfriend was next to me working on his tablet. I know exactly how long we were there because I was playing a game with a timer running. After maybe 15 or 20 minutes, my boyfriend kind of sighed and called out Gail's name. I told him, "He won't hear you. He's got headphones on." A few minutes later, Gail shouted from downstairs, "What?" My boyfriend looked at me, confused, because neither of us had said anything again. But he answered, "When you come up, bring me my laptop." A little while later, Gail came upstairs holding it, looking annoyed, and said, "Why didn't you just grab it when you were downstairs?" We both just stared at him. I said, "What do you mean?" My blood ran cold. Because my boyfriend had not moved. Not once. I had the timer right there in my hand. We had both been upstairs the whole time. My boyfriend told him, very calmly, "Nobody went downstairs. Ask your mom." And Gael looked at me, waiting for me to laugh or admit we were messing with him. But I just nodded and said, "We've been here the whole time, baby." He went pale. Then he explained that he'd heard footsteps, heard the fridge open and close, heard my boyfriend's voice call him from outside the bathroom. He even took one headphone off because he thought he was being rushed. But when he answered, the voice suddenly sounded like it was coming from upstairs. That night, Gael slept in our bed. He was terrified. He kept trying to talk about it, and my boyfriend kept shutting it down. Later, when Gael had settled a little, I asked my boyfriend if he'd noticed other things too. He went quiet, wouldn't look at me, and then he said, very softly, "If I told you everything I've seen here, you might stop coming over." That sentence has stayed with me, because he has always acted strange in certain parts of the house. He hates when I stand too close to the upstairs railing. He'll distract me, steer me away from certain corners, keep me from looking in certain directions. It made me wonder if something had happened to him there, if maybe he'd seen something, or even been touched or shoved. The thing is, I don't really see things. I feel them. I sense when something is there, when the energy changes, when the air gets thick or the back of my neck turns cold. My boyfriend, though, he's always been the kind of person who sees more than he wants to. He's told me stories before, about sleep paralysis, dreams that came true, shapes in the room, things like that. So one day, I decided to do something desperate. I talked to the house. I came over after work while the boys were out at band rehearsal. They're both musicians. And I stood there and said out loud, basically, "Look, I know this might be your place too. I'm not here to cause trouble. I take care of this home. I clean it, I care for it, I keep the garden alive. The boys are messy, you know that. I'm trying to help, So please, let's live peacefully together. You can be here, just don't scare me. I know how that sounds. But that night, nothing happened. So of course I started thinking maybe it worked. Then in late January, my boyfriend and Gael left on a music trip for a few weeks, and I had to look after the house and the cat while they were gone. The first night I stayed there alone, I could feel something upstairs while I was downstairs. Then when I went upstairs, I felt like something was below me. It was like the whole house was breathing around me. I was folding clothes in the bedroom when suddenly I felt this icy presence right behind my back. Not a draft, not a cold room, a presence. I turned around and looked at this large instrument case my boyfriend keeps by the wall, and while I was staring at it, it lifted itself upright. I cannot explain to you how hard my heart was pounding. I thought I might actually pass out. That case had never moved on its own before. Never. And I did the only thing I could think of. I pretended I hadn't seen it. A minute later, I casually leaned it back against the wall like that was a normal thing to do. Then I turned back to the laundry, and almost immediately, I felt that same presence at my back again, stronger this time, like it wanted me to turn around again. So I closed my eyes and whispered, "No, we had an agreement. You said you wouldn't scare me. Please respect that." And just like that, the feeling disappeared. She's very into spiritual work, candles, cleansing, all of that. Not reckless, just experienced. Before we went in, I warned her. At night, we do not talk about what happens in this house. If anything happens, we discuss it in the morning. The second she stepped inside, she stopped and frowned. She said, "This place feels awful, heavy, like there are too many things here." That night, the windows were open because the house traps heat and feels suffocating. My friend sat by the front window to get some air while I washed dishes. After a while, I noticed she kept staring outside with this really tense look on her face. Then later, she started staring at the staircase leading upstairs. I turned on the light over the stairs and told her there was nothing there. She nodded, but she did not look convinced. A while after that, she said she was tired and ran upstairs to the bedroom. I stayed behind to lock up and finally use the bathroom. I'm terrified of bathrooms at night in that house, so I never shut the door all the way. While I was in there, with the door slightly open, I heard someone come downstairs and knock lightly. I said, "What is it, sweetheart? Do you need the bathroom?" And from upstairs, my friend yelled, "What?" I froze. I washed my hands so fast I nearly slipped, then ran upstairs. She was in bed and immediately asked me to sleep on the outer side, near the railing, which I hate because I always sleep facing the wall. But I did it. Then she asked me, "Is that your cat?" I looked toward the stairs and said, "No, she's downstairs eating." My friend pulled the blanket over her head. We went to sleep like that. The next morning, I woke up on the floor, which is normal for me if I sleep on the edge. But honestly, thank God I don't see what other people see, because there's a huge gap under that bed, and I don't ever want to know what might be there. By late morning, the house felt lighter again. My friend said, "At night it gets much worse." Then she told me everything. She said that when she had been staring out the window the night before, there was a woman's face right there outside, less than a meter away, looking around the property. Not a vague shadow, a face. She said every time she looked back, the woman was still there, trying to catch her eye. The only reason she knew it wasn't a real person was because I couldn't see her. Then the woman vanished. After that, my friend saw what looked like a man standing partway down the stairs. Not fully visible, more like legs and the lower shape of him. When I turned the light on, he disappeared. When I turned it off, he came back. She said the knock on the bathroom door definitely wasn't her. And the reason she made me sleep on the outer edge of the bed? She said there had been a man peeking over the upstairs railing, watching us. Watching me. Making eye contact with me, while I was completely unaware. She told me something that really stayed with me. She said whatever was in that house knew I couldn't see them, so they didn't waste energy trying to show themselves to me. But they absolutely knew who could see them. That was why they targeted her, and probably why they targeted my boyfriend and Gael too. As we talked, the house got heavier again. I got goosebumps all over, my body's usual warning sign. My friend started trying to make sense of the pattern, because whatever was there didn't behave the same with each of us. With me, it mostly watched. It tested me, but didn't go too far. With my boyfriend, it caused chaos, throwing clothes down, shifting furniture, making messes. With Gael, it was crueler. Knocking on his door when he was alone, moving his chair while he sat in it, pulling the blanket off him in bed, saying his name when no one else was home. So she looked at the instrument case and said, "Do what you did before if you're a kid." Nothing happened at first. Then the case slowly straightened on its own. She leaned it back and said, "Move it again if you're a good boy." And it moved again. She smiled at me and said, "This one isn't dangerous. Mischievous, yes, but not dangerous." And right then, a violent slam exploded through the house. The bathroom door had shut so hard it sounded like it might split. All the windows were closed by then. No wind, no draft, nothing. Then we heard footsteps. Not light ones, not subtle ones. Heavy, dragging, deliberate. I whispered, "I've never heard them this clearly before." The steps moved through the house, not toward us at first, but straight to the front door, the one I had locked. Then something grabbed the handle and started wrenching it. The door shook so violently the wall behind the bed rattled. The headboard banged. It felt like the whole house was being yanked apart. And my friend shouted, "Even the child spirit is scared of this one." I started praying, talking, begging. I said all kinds of things, half crying, half gasping, telling it to rest, to move on, that its time on earth was over, that it deserved peace. I don't even remember all of it. It didn't help. Then my friend yelled, "Stop! Please, you've done enough! Stop!" And somehow, it did. Just stopped. 5 minutes later, when we finally got downstairs, she lit a candle. The flame flickered hard, like something was trying to blow it out. I asked if that was bad, and she looked at me and said, "Bad enough that if it goes out, we leave everything and run." The candle stayed lit, but we still did what we had to do and got out of there as fast as we could. And that brings me to now. The boys are back today, and I'm going over tonight. Honestly, I don't know exactly what lives in that house. I don't know if it's one thing, several things, leftovers of people, something attached to the place, or something attached to us. What I do know is this: that house answers back, and whatever is there knows each of us very, very well. Honestly, this is one of those things I still can't fully explain, but it's stayed with me ever since. My granddad, Arthur, died in 2006, about a year before I was born, so I never got the chance to know him. When I was younger, I didn't really think too much about that, but the older I've gotten, the more I've found myself wondering what he was like, what it would have felt like to sit with him, talk to him, or just have one memory of my own with him. I play guitar every now and then, and a few years ago, my nan gave me his old guitar. Since then, it's been sitting on a stand in the corner of my room. I've always liked having it there. It feels special, even if I couldn't really say why. One night, my friend's dog was staying over. She's a lively dog during the day, full of energy, but she's not the kind of dog that barks for no reason. And when it's bedtime, she settles down straight away. So that night, I put her bed at the foot of mine, and just like usual, she curled up and went to sleep. Then, out of nowhere, she suddenly lifted her head like something had caught her attention. At first, she seemed confused, like she was trying to work out where the sound or feeling was coming from. Then she locked onto the corner of my room, right where the guitar was. She got up, walked over to it, sniffed around it, and then just started barking like mad. Not playful barking either. Proper, intense barking, staring right at the guitar the whole time. What made it even stranger was that she was usually so obedient. Normally, one quick no, and she'd stop instantly. But this time, she completely ignored me. She just kept barking and barking until my nan woke up, came upstairs, and we both had to take the dog downstairs to calm her down. At the time, I remember thinking it was weird, but I didn't let myself dwell on it too much. I just went back to bed. That night, though, I had a dream that felt different from any dream I'd had before. In it, I was much younger, maybe 8 or 9, sitting on the floor of my room with an old stuffed bear I hadn't seen in years. The dog was there too, racing around happily, full of energy. Then this man sat down with the guitar and started playing All I Have to Do Is Dream. The second he started playing, everything felt calm. The dog settled immediately, and I just sat there watching him. I remember feeling this overwhelming sense of comfort, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And more than that, I had this deep feeling that the man playing was someone important to me, someone safe, someone I should know. When I woke up, I couldn't shake it. Later on, I mentioned the song to my family, and that's when I found out my granddad used to play and sing that exact song to my mom and uncle when they were little, almost like a lullaby to help them fall asleep. That's the part that really gets me, because before all of this, I'd never dreamed about him. I hadn't even spent much time thinking about him in any serious way. And yet somehow, that song appeared in my dream, tied to his guitar, right after the dog reacted so strangely to it. So I still find myself wondering whether that was his way of reaching out to me. Maybe not in some dramatic, ghost story kind of way, but just in a quiet, gentle way. Almost like he was saying, I know you. I'm here. You're part of me too. I'm not someone who believes every paranormal story I hear. I'm pretty on the fence with that kind of thing. But I also can't ignore how personal this felt, or how much peace it gave me. And what makes it even more interesting is that even the people in my family who don't believe in anything supernatural still seem to have at least one story they can't explain. Either way, I know this. It didn't feel frightening. It felt loving. And that's why a part of me will always believe it meant something. Hey, I've never really been able to explain this properly, but this happened during the COVID lockdowns, around April 2021. I was about 12 back then, and since schools were shut down, my mom sent me to stay with my cousin's family out in their village, so I wouldn't be stuck bored at home all day. My uncle there, well, I'll call him Uncle Raffy, had this little delivery truck, and he used it for work. He used to take me with him a lot because I could help carry the smaller stuff, and he liked saying it was a good way for me to get familiar with the roads around the area. Most nights, we'd be home by maybe 9 or 10. Nothing unusual. But one night, one of the deliveries took way longer than expected. We started driving back close to 11:30 p.m. The roads were completely empty. You know how villages get at night. Everything shuts down early. People go to sleep, and the whole place feels almost too quiet. We were on this road with thick forest on both sides, just darkness everywhere except for the truck's headlights. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a while, I started noticing we should have reached the next village already. Then more time passed, and still, just forest. No houses, no lights, nothing. I looked over at Uncle Raffy, and I could tell he was getting nervous. He was gripping the wheel tighter, staring straight ahead. He didn't say anything, probably because he didn't want me to panic, but I could feel it. Something was wrong. That road had never taken that long before. Then, up ahead, we saw this heavy fog drifting across the road. And that's it. That's the last thing I remember. When I came to, the first thing I felt was freezing water soaking through my shoes. I was disoriented, like my head was packed with cotton. Uncle Raffi was next to me, groaning a little, and then he grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. What that light showed us, I still get chills thinking about it. We were still inside the truck, but the truck was sitting in the middle of a river. The water was shallow, maybe a little above our ankles, but it was ice cold. Uncle Raffi shoved open the door, and we climbed out, just standing there shivering, trying to understand what we were looking at. Then we turned around, and I swear, my whole body went cold. Behind us, not far at all, was the edge of a steep drop, basically a cliff. Somehow, we had gone over it. We should have crashed. The truck should have been wrecked. We should have been badly hurt, or worse, but we weren't. Not a single cut, not even a bruise. And the truck, from what we could see in the dark, didn't look smashed up either. It made no sense. Uncle Raffi checked his phone again. No signal, but he could still see the time. It was around 3 a.m. We had lost more than 3 hours. At that point, there was nothing else to do, so we started walking upstream through the dark, following the river against the current. I remember feeling exhausted and scared, and just wanting to see another person. After a while, we finally spotted a few lights in the distance, a small group of houses. We knocked on one of the doors, and this family let us in for the night. They didn't ask many questions. I think one look at us told them enough, and somehow, it was completely fine. No major damage. It honestly looked like someone had gently set it down in the water. It took a whole group of men to pull it back out. What really stayed with me, though, happened as we were leaving. One of the older men from the village came over and spoke quietly to my uncle. He looked in the direction we'd walked the night before, and then looked back at us. He said, "It's a good thing you went upstream. If you had followed the river the other way, you would have ended up near the old cemetery and the morgue." I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know how we lost those hours, or how we went over that drop and survived without a scratch. I just know it was the most terrifying thing I've ever lived through. And honestly, I'm still grateful I made it out at all. I want to share a memory from when I was very little, probably around 2 or 3 years old. This would have been in the early 1980s, when I was staying with my grandparents in a quiet part of Washington state. They lived in a secluded house surrounded by trees, the kind of place where it felt like the outside world was far away. Even though I was so young, I've always had unusually early memories, and this is one that has stayed with me in a very clear and specific way my whole life. At the time, my little bed was set up in a big back room of the house, right near a huge window that looked out onto a wooded yard. I remember being put down for an afternoon nap like usual. Everything felt normal. When I woke up, I heard this soft tapping sound on the window. I stood up and looked outside, and there was a figure standing there. It looked human in shape, but not like an ordinary person. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like it was made completely of green glass. Not transparent like a ghost, not shadowy, not wearing anything that shimmered that way. The whole figure itself looked smooth, solid, and glass-like. At first, I wasn't scared at all. It actually felt playful. The figure leaned closer to the window and put its hands around its eyes, like someone trying to peek in better. Then it waved at me. I remember laughing and waving back. It felt almost friendly, the way an adult might try to make a small child smile by being silly. But then, something changed. It moved its hands and flipped them upside down around its eyes, almost like it was making a strange mask or a pair of upside-down goggles. I can still picture that gesture so clearly. And the second it did that, my feeling changed completely. I wasn't uneasy first. I wasn't confused first. It was instant, overwhelming terror. I started screaming as hard as I could. My grandmother came rushing into the room because I was crying so hard I could barely catch my breath. I pointed toward the window, but by then, there was nothing there. My grandfather checked outside and around the house, and he didn't find anyone. Now, as an adult, I understand that memories from that age can be complicated. Early memories can be shaped over time, reconstructed, or influenced by emotion. I'm not claiming with certainty that this was something paranormal, or even that it was definitely something outside the window at all. But what's always stayed with me is how consistent the memory has been for decades. Not just what I saw, but the emotional shift. It began as something light and almost funny, and then, in a single moment, it became one of the most frightening experiences I can remember. I've always wondered what to make of it. Was it some kind of vivid waking dream? A hypnopompic hallucination after sleep? A child's mind interpreting something ordinary in an extraordinary way? Or something else entirely? I still don't know. I just know that the memory has never left me. I still think about this sometimes, even now. It happened during the summer break, not long after I'd finished primary school, back in the mid-2000s, in my little village in Merseyside. It was one of those unusually hot English summers where every day seemed golden and endless, and all I wanted to do was be outside. Me and my friends were always off on our bikes, disappearing for hours, convincing ourselves every ordinary path or field was the start of some adventure. One evening, my best friend Mikey was at mine, and we got talking about ghosts. I was obsessed with anything paranormal back then. I'd recently watched a film about people trying to hear messages from the dead through recordings, and I was glued to those ghost hunting shows on telly too. I loved how frightening it all felt, especially at that age, when your imagination could turn anything into something eerie. So, naturally, we decided we were going to try it ourselves. Mikey went home and came back with this old cassette recorder he'd found, along with a couple of tapes. That night, when it was properly dark, probably around 9:30 or so, we walked over to the old churchyard near my house. The gates were always open, and even though we'd passed through there loads of times in daylight, at night it felt completely different. The church itself was just this dark shape in front of us, and beyond the walls you could see the glow of a few streetlights and the occasional car slipping by on the road. Other than that, it was silent. We sat on the step outside the church door, trying to act brave, though I'm sure we were both nervous already. I pressed record on the cassette player and, putting on my best ghost hunter voice, said, "Is anybody there?" Then we left it for a few seconds, just letting the tape run before stopping it. We honestly expected nothing. It was just kids messing about, trying to spook ourselves. But when we played it back, my voice came through first, clear as anything. "Is anybody there?" And then, right after it, there was another voice. A woman's voice. Not faint, not crackly, not something you had to strain to hear. It was clear, calm, and right there on the tape. She said, "Behind the yew tree." I can still remember the feeling that went through me when I heard it. It was like every bit of warmth left my body at once. Me and Mikey absolutely panicked. We ran. We swore we were never going back, and that was that. Except, of course, it wasn't. Because the very next day, in broad daylight, we went straight back. This time, we stood in front of the church instead of sitting on the steps. like that somehow made us safer. We used the recorder again, asked the same question, and once again, when we played it back, the same woman's voice answered. After that, we started asking more. Proper questions. We wanted to know who she was, what she wanted, whether she was really there. And every time, there came a reply. I kept watching Mikey out of the corner of my eye, because part of me was convinced he had to be winding me up somehow. But it wasn't him. The voice sounded older than either of us, worn and weak somehow, like someone speaking through illness or exhaustion. We asked her name and she said, Lila. That name stuck with me. So did the way she spoke about her husband, Walter. She called him, my dear Walter, more than once. There was something sad in her voice, something tender. We asked her how she died, and she told us she'd been ill. We asked if she was buried there in the churchyard, and she said yes. Then, somehow, we ended up following her, and there it all was. Her name, Lila. Her husband, Walter, buried with her. The details matched what we'd heard. I remember just staring at that gravestone, feeling like the world had tilted slightly and would never sit right again. We went back a few more times after that and tried speaking to her again. Sometimes we got responses, sometimes less than before. Then life moved on, as it does. Me and Mikey drifted a bit during our teenage years, and eventually the whole thing became something we didn't really talk about. But I never forgot it. A few years later, I went back on my own and tried again, this time using my mobile phone to record, but nothing happened. I've gone back more than once over the years, really, always with the same quiet hope that maybe I'd hear that voice again. I never did. Still, that experience never left me. It changed something in me. Before that, ghosts and hauntings were just spooky fun, just stories and late-night television, and the thrill of being scared. After that, I couldn't look at it the same way anymore. I wasn't just wondering whether there might be something beyond what we understand. I felt like I'd brushed against it. A few years ago, when Mikey and I were back in touch properly, I brought it up again. I didn't have to explain much. He remembered it too. Every bit of it. That, more than anything, is what stayed with me. Not just the voice, not just the grave, but the fact that I didn't experience it alone. There's someone else in this world who was there with me, who heard what I heard, who knows I'm not inventing it. I still don't know who or what we were speaking to. I don't know if it really was Lila. I don't know why that old cassette recorder seemed to matter, or whether it did at all. But I do know this. Whatever happened in that churchyard all those years ago changed the way I see the world. And even now, part of me still wonders what would happen if I found another old tape recorder, went back to that same spot, and asked one more time, "Is anybody there?" So, I grew up in South Texas, where stories like this are just part of life. The kind of place where Hispanic and indigenous traditions run side by side, and from the time you're little, you hear about lechuzas, la llorona, brujas, all of it. In my family, those stories were never treated like entertainment. They were warnings, lessons. We were taught that if there's healing in the world, there's harm too, and my grandmother took protecting us from that seriously. This happened maybe a little over 20 years ago, back when I was still in high school. My grandfather started saying there was a woman in white who walked along the porch outside his house late at night. Most of the family brushed it off. They thought maybe age was catching up with him, or that he was imagining things. But he was completely certain about what he'd seen. I was always the curious one when it came to the paranormal, so I asked him when she showed up. He told me, late at night, when everything goes quiet. And if you've ever been out in rural Texas after dark, you know exactly the kind of quiet he meant. Not just nighttime quiet, deeper than that. The kind of stillness that settles in around 2 or 3 in the morning, when there are no cars passing, no dogs barking, no music in the distance. It feels like the whole world is asleep. So I started staying up, waiting. I wanted to see her for myself. Night after night, I'd sit there watching, listening, hoping to catch even a glimpse of this woman in white my grandfather swore was there. But I never saw anything. After a while, I gave up. I figured maybe it was just one of those stories that belonged to him and not to me. Then years passed. Around the time my daughter was born, I had something happen that I still don't fully know how to explain. I call it a dream because I don't know what else to call it, but it didn't feel like an ordinary dream. I remember floating above the bed, looking down at myself, my wife, and the baby sleeping beside us. Everything was calm, still. But what stood out most was this feeling. Someone was gently stroking my hair, almost the way you'd comfort a child. Then I started drifting back down, toward my body, and just as I was about to return, something stopped me. A hand came up, soft but firm, like it was telling me to wait. That's when I saw her. She was dressed in white, and somehow I understood that my head had been resting in her lap the whole time. She was the one smoothing my hair back. She looked at me and said very softly, "Shh, not yet. Let him sleep." Then she turned her attention back toward my body and smiled. That's all I remember. But ever since that night, I've carried this strange certainty that the woman who once watched over my grandfather is somehow with me now. And I don't mean that in a frightening way. It's never felt evil. If anything, it feels protective, like she's standing nearby, keeping watch, waiting until it's time to move on to whoever needs her next. I still think about it, about whether a spirit can follow a family line, whether something meant to protect one person can choose another. I don't know the answer. I just know that ever since that night, I've never felt like she was a stranger. So this all started back in 2020, when my family bought a second apartment. The place had belonged to an elderly couple. The husband had passed away there, and his wife, who was known for being deeply spiritual and devoted to her faith, eventually sold it to us for much less than we expected. At the time, it just felt like one of those unusual but lucky deals. When we first moved in, nothing seemed off. Everything felt normal. Back then, I was going through a rough patch emotionally. I had just come out of a breakup, and I wasn't in the best headspace. Since the apartment wasn't our main home, I used to go there by myself a lot, especially during the lockdown period. I'd sit alone for hours with my game console on, all the lights off, just enjoying the quiet and trying to shut my mind off for a while. And honestly, at first, I liked the solitude. But then, little things started happening. Sometimes the air in the apartment would suddenly turn freezing cold for no reason. I'd feel this strange heaviness in my body, like I was being weighed down. Other times, I could swear I heard chairs scraping or a table shifting in the next room. I kept trying to explain it away. I told myself it was probably the neighbors upstairs, or the building settling, or just my imagination working overtime. Still, there was this fear that would come out of nowhere. A few times I remember saving my game in a panic, grabbing my keys, and rushing out without even really knowing why. I just felt like I needed to leave. Then one night, something happened that really stayed with me. The apartment had 3 bedrooms, my parents' room, mine, and a guest room. The living room opened into the dining area, and the fridge was right there near the kitchen. It was around 1 in the morning. I was sitting by the window in my room. The lights were off, and the only light came from this small, warm lamp I had on. Outside, the street was completely empty, just those dim yellow streetlights lighting up the road. No people, no movement, nothing. And then, inside my room, I noticed a shadow. At first, I tried to be logical about it. I thought maybe someone had walked past outside and their shadow had somehow stretched into the room. But I was right next to the window. I looked outside immediately and there was no one there. Not a single person. When I turned back, the shadow was gone. And almost at that exact moment, my mom started pounding on my door. She kept telling me, "Come out, come sleep in our room." I remember being confused because I felt fine, shaken maybe, but I didn't want to admit it. I asked her what was wrong, but she wouldn't explain. She just kept insisting. So I took my phone and went to sleep in their room that night. The next morning, I asked her what had happened. She told me she'd explain later, once we got back to our main house. And when we did, she finally told me this. She had been lying on the sofa that night, scrolling on her phone, when she saw what looked like a person standing near the fridge, just staring at her. At first, she thought it was my dad. She casually asked for a glass of water, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, looking at her. Then she called my father's name louder, expecting him to respond, and suddenly that figure ran into the kitchen. She got up and followed it right away, but when she reached the kitchen, no one was there. Then she checked the bedroom and found my dad fast asleep. That was when she panicked and ran straight to my room. Even then, I always felt uneasy there. Not terrified every second, just watched. And heavy, like the air itself didn't want me staying too long. A while later, I started feeling dizzy whenever I spent too much time there. At first, I blamed it on staring at a screen for too long or not sleeping properly. But then another incident happened. One afternoon, my ex came over. We were in my room watching a movie in the dark, just relaxing, sipping soda from glasses. Out of nowhere, one of the glasses slid off the shelf and smashed on the floor. There was no reason for it to fall. I turned on the lights, cleaned everything up, and went to the bathroom for a minute. When I came back, we hugged, and just as we were about to sit down on the bed, we both froze. There were tiny office pins scattered all across the bedspread. The weird part was, those pins were normally kept in my parents' room, on a completely different shelf. Neither of us had moved them. And somehow now they were spread out exactly where we were about to sit. That was already enough to make our skin crawl. Then we heard it, the sound of furniture dragging in the dining area. Chairs scraping, something shifting heavily, like someone was moving things around. My ex got really frightened and said we had to leave right then. So I walked her home, and after that I went straight back to my parents' place. Not long after, my mother and I told my grandmother everything. She's a very devout woman, and she took it seriously right away. She contacted a religious man she trusted, and he gave her something blessed, telling her to place it somewhere hidden deep inside the apartment. We also did a cleansing ritual there. I remember my grandmother burning cleansing herbs and prayers over a bowl, then asking me to carry it and place it exactly where I had first seen that shadow in my room. The second I set it down, I felt overwhelmingly dizzy. It was so intense, like the whole room spun around me in circles. For a moment, it felt impossible to stay standing. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Everything went calm. The apartment felt different after that. Lighter. It's hard to explain unless you've felt something like that before, but the heaviness that used to sit in the rooms was just gone. Even now, every once in a while, I still get a faint uneasy feeling when I'm there alone. Not the same kind of fear as before, just a little chill in the back of my mind. But whatever used to be there, I don't think it's there anymore. And sometimes I wonder, maybe it finally found peace. So, I still think about this one camping trip all the time. A few years ago, my family and I went camping out near the mountains, and one night, my sister Mara decided it would be fun to start telling scary stories around the fire. At first, it was the usual creepy stuff, but then she started talking about skinwalkers and kept repeating the name over and over. The second she started, I felt wrong. I've always been really sensitive to things other people don't seem to notice, and almost immediately, I got this deep feeling of dread in my stomach. It was like this heavy ache settled in my gut, and suddenly, I felt way too alert for a normal night sitting around a campfire. I kept getting the feeling that something was behind me, watching me. I couldn't shake it. My younger cousin was getting nervous too, but not in the same way. He just hated scary stories. Me, I felt like something had actually noticed us. That night, the sleeping setup was split between two trailers. My sister, my mom, my grandma, and I were in one, and my cousin was in the other with my uncle. Before everyone turned in, my cousin straight up told me, "I'm not leaving the trailer tonight. I don't care what happens. I'm too freaked out." That stuck with me. Later, when I was just starting to drift off, I heard movement outside. Not light footsteps, heavy ones. Slow, deliberate steps moving around our trailer. At first, I tried to explain it away. I told myself maybe it was a bear, or maybe some other big animal wandering through the campsite. But even then, it didn't feel right. The sound was too intentional, too aware. And then I heard a voice outside. "Allie, I'm scared." It sounded like my cousin, almost. That's the only way I can explain it. It was close enough to be him, but something was off. It was like whatever was speaking knew what his voice sounded like, but didn't understand how fear actually sounds. It was pretending. The voice felt hollow. I froze. Then it said, "Allie, please come out here. I don't want to go to the bathroom alone." I still didn't answer, because right away, my mind went to one question. Why would he come to me instead of waking up his dad? And if there was really a large animal outside, why would he just be standing there talking? Everything in me was screaming that it was not him. So I stayed completely still and said nothing. The voice called again, and this time it sounded more irritated, less human, like it was losing patience. That weird, almost right quality got worse, and by then I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was outside was not my cousin. Then everything went quiet. A few seconds later, I heard the footsteps stop right outside our trailer door. I can still remember how terrified I felt in that moment, just staring into the dark, barely breathing. Then came the scratching. Slow at first, then more deliberate, dragging across the outside of the door. And then something shoved the trailer hard enough to make it shake. That woke my sister up. She looked over at me, and I must have looked completely panicked, because I put my finger to my lips and silently begged her not to make a sound. Thank God, she understood and stayed quiet. The scratching went on for a little longer, and then eventually it stopped. Whatever it was had moved on, or given up. The next morning, I went straight to my cousin and asked him, "Did you leave your trailer at all last night?" He looked at me and said, "No. Did you? I heard something outside ours too." That was the moment every last bit of doubt disappeared. It hadn't been him. And it hadn't been me either. A few weeks after we got home, I looked up the area where we had camped and found out it was right along the edge of the Appalachians. After that, none of us ever wanted to go back. And honestly, neither did I. You know, my father died when I was very young, just 3 years old, back in the early 1980s. He died after falling down a flight of stairs while he was drunk. After that, a lot of blame got thrown at my mother, especially from his side of the family. His father, my grandfather, seemed to hold her responsible in some deep, bitter way, and over the years I heard people say he even cursed her. and all of us connected to her. My earliest memories are not gentle ones. I remember fear before I even understood what fear was. I remember my father hurting my mother, and I remember watching things no child should ever see from my little bed. Later, my mother told me about a moment outside the house when I was only around 2 or 3. My father had slapped her in front of me, and I had picked up a little branch and tried to hit him with it. She said he turned and kicked me away. That story stayed with me. After he died, my mother and I moved to the town where her parents lived. That became home. Once in a while, I still visited my father's side of the family, but it never really felt like I belonged there. My grandfather was a hard, controlling man. He ruled over the farm and over everyone in it, especially my grandmother, who seemed to live her whole life in quiet suffering. They had horses and other animals, and I think the horses were part of what drew my mother into that family in the first place. She loved them deeply. Years passed. By the early 2000s, I was away studying in a distant city, trying to build some kind of life for myself. By then, my mother had fallen deep into alcoholism. Around that same time, my grandfather was close to death. My uncle and cousins reached out to my mother, but she never told me. She had so much anger toward them that she kept me out of it completely. Then one day, I got a letter from the court. It said my grandfather had disinherited me on his deathbed. The reason they gave was that I had shown no interest in him. But I knew, or at least I felt, that the whole thing had been arranged by the others on that side of the family, so they could keep the land and everything else for themselves. I was young then, angry and impulsive. I tore the letter into pieces on my way to meet friends at a bar, and I remember saying out loud, "Fine, we'll settle this in hell, you old bastard." I never challenged it legally. At the time, I told myself I belonged to my mother's side anyway, not his. I wanted nothing from them. But over the years, loss kept visiting my mother's side of the family, one after another. My aunt's husband died in the mid-1990s. A few years later, my grandmother died from cancer. Then more tragedy came. My cousins, my mother, my grandfather on her side too. Little by little, that whole branch of the family seemed to disappear, until it was basically just me and my aunt left standing. And for all those years, there was this shadow in the background, my paternal grandfather. It was like some part of me stayed bound to him through hatred. I didn't think about him every day. Life itself was already heavy enough. My whole life had been shaped by trauma in one way or another. But somewhere deep in me, he was still there. And once I saw that, something in me let go. I forgave him. Not because what he did was acceptable, not because the past changed, but because in that moment, I no longer wanted to carry him as poison inside me. When I woke up, that feeling stayed. It was like love, but not sentimental love. Something bigger, calmer, cleaner. It stayed with me the whole day, strong and unmistakable. Even now, I can still remember it. And honestly, I believe something was released that night. Maybe him, maybe me, maybe both. Sometimes I feel like he had been trapped somewhere inside his own darkness, and through that dream, through that forgiveness, I helped him move on. That's what it felt like anyway. And for the first time, that story no longer feels like only a story of violence, blame, and grief. It also feels like a story of release. Hey, I'm Marin, and I'm hoping you can help me with something a little unusual. My family and I are putting together a weekend hike on the Appalachian Trail in Vermont. There'll be 8 of us total, and we're all pretty seasoned hikers, so we're comfortable with long miles, rough terrain, and being out there for a few days. We're planning to start early Friday morning and wrap up sometime Sunday evening, and we're aiming for a section that's around 24 to 27 miles. Now, this is the part that tends to make people pause. We're not looking for the prettiest stretch. We're looking for the one that feels off. You know the kind of place I mean. Woods that seem normal in daylight, but the second it gets dark, something about them shifts. Places where every snapped twig sounds too deliberate, where knocking in the distance doesn't quite sound like a woodpecker, where footsteps make you stop because they don't match your own. Maybe there are voices people swear they heard, even when nobody else was around. Maybe there's a shelter or campsite that always seems to come up in a lowered voice, or locals who tell you, real casually, "Yeah, don't stay there." That's the kind of atmosphere we're after. We're not trying to be reckless, and we're definitely not interested in doing anything stupid. We hike responsibly, we follow leave no trace, and we take safety seriously. But my family has always bonded over creepy stories, old mountain folklore, and those weird moments in the woods that make you question every sound after sundown. Honestly, that heavy, haunted feeling is part of the draw for us. So I'm trying to find a section of the Vermont AT that really carries that reputation. Somewhere isolated, somewhere unsettling, somewhere with history, rumors, legends, whatever people around there still whisper about. If you know of any specific stretches in that mileage range, especially ones tied to folklore, cryptid sightings, strange incidents, or just a long-standing bad feeling, I'd really love to hear about them. And if you've had a personal experience on that part of the trail, something you still think about, I'd want to hear that too. Honestly, ever since I was little, I've had this strange relationship with dreams. I could lucid dream sometimes, and even when I wasn't fully aware inside them, I'd still remember everything in this intense, almost cinematic detail. What really unsettled me was that little pieces of those dreams would show up later in real life, sometimes a few weeks later, sometimes years. At first I brushed it off as coincidence, but after it happened enough times, I started holding on to the details, almost waiting for them to appear. Then it got even stranger. It stopped feeling like I was only dreaming about my own life. Sometimes I'd remember parts of someone else's story before they ever told me. Other times I'd be standing there, about to make a decision, and suddenly it would hit me like a flash. This sharp memory of choosing one option, plus the chain of events that came after it. When I got older, especially during a rough period when I was smoking more than I should have, those flashes started feeling closer. Not years away anymore, more like days, maybe a couple of weeks. I know that sounds wild, and I know how easy it would be to hear this and think I'm losing it, but I'm just telling you what I experienced. When I was a kid, I used to have the same nightmare over and over about my grandmother and my great-grandmother dying one after the other. It scared me so badly that my mom would actually call them to calm me down, and my grandma, being exactly who she was, would reassure me and tell me everything was fine. Then, years later, in 2022, my grandmother passed in February, and my great-grandmother followed in April. Same order as the dream. Even the funeral details felt hauntingly familiar, right down to the casket. There was another time with an older cousin of mine. I hadn't seen her in weeks. One night I dreamed she came to me and told me she had died and that she needed to leave. The next day, I found out she'd passed in her sleep that same night. That one stayed with me in a way I still can't explain. Then there was this moment with my ex. Let's call her Shay. She was telling me about someone from her past, and while she was talking, I interrupted her because I genuinely thought I already knew the whole story. I even explained back to her why the relationship ended, and she just stared at me and said, "I never told you any of that." I can't even explain the feeling that gave me. It rattled me so badly that I spiraled. At the time, I was in treatment, and when I tried to explain it to my psychiatrist, she told me it sounded like cognitive distortion. But to me, it felt so real, like I was remembering something that had already happened. One of the creepiest experiences happened when I was younger and thinking about running away. I'd been talking to this random guy online, and before I ever met him, I had this vivid dream. He kept pushing me to smoke, kept crossing lines, kept trying to get me to do things I didn't want to do. In the dream, I remember being in a public bathroom near a station in Philly. He wanted me leaning over a sink while he took photos, and I remember feeling trapped enough that I called my dad and told him where I was. The dream scared me so much that I cut the guy off completely.
Not all of it was about people.
Some of it was the weirdest, smallest stuff. I once dreamed about this very specific clothing rack, white metal, kind of minimal, with a top bar that could rotate. The dream felt so familiar that I never mentioned it and never bought it. A couple of weeks later, I walked into my parents' garage, and there it was. The exact one. Another time, I somehow knew the inside of a neighbor's house without ever stepping foot in it. My younger siblings used to have playdates there, but I never went inside. Still, I described their kitchen, the living room flooring, the color scheme, even this vase and the tiny details painted on it. I also described what their son looked like, even though I'd never actually seen him. When I told my little brother, he said I got it right. That one really messed with me. I also think one of those visions helped me dodge a relationship before it turned fully abusive. Back in 2020, I had this odd flash of being in a shop with a boyfriend I didn't have yet. We were in Boston in the vision, walking through an anime store, and there was this glass case with Studio Ghibli wallets inside. In the vision, I picked the wallet on the right, and somehow I knew that version of my life ended with constant fights about money, him belittling my art, him storming out and throwing tantrums. Then, in late 2023, I ended up in that exact kind of moment with my boyfriend at the time. Same uneasy feeling, same display case, same two-wallet choice. So I chose the one on the left instead. And even though that didn't magically save the relationship, it did seem to shift something. Over the next few weeks, he started saying cruel things that showed me exactly who he was. Stuff about my family, my upbringing, where I came from. I left quickly after that. The whole thing made me feel like I'd seen the warning ahead of time and barely stepped around it. And honestly, those are just some of the examples. There are more. The ones that scare me most aren't even these short flashes. They're the dreams where I seem to live entire lifetimes. Full lives, childhood to old age, love, work, regret, death. I can remember at least 2 deaths that felt like old age, and others that felt much darker. Those are the ones I have the hardest time talking about. There was also a period after a really serious attempt last year when I became convinced something had shifted. In those last moments, before everything faded, I heard my grandmother's voice so clearly telling me to get up. I remember fighting for air. And afterward, for days, I had this awful feeling that I was remembering things that didn't belong to this version of my life. Parts of my house looked wrong, or different, or newly there. A few paintings in my family home felt unfamiliar, but at the same time, I had memories of them always being there. For about a week, I kept hearing crying in my head. I don't know how to explain that without sounding unreal, but that's how it felt. Like I had slipped sideways into a slightly different timeline. What stays with me most, though, is one particular full-life dream. In it, I went straight to college after graduation and struggled badly. I became a doctor because that's what my father wanted, and in that life, I worshipped that path. I believed his pressure had saved me. I remember graduating. I remember working in a hospital. I remember having a daughter. And I remember hurting her without realizing it, pushing her too hard, the same way I had been pushed. Eventually, she cut me off. My daughter came back in the end, but not in some sentimental, healed way. She came back because I was dying. She spoke to the doctors. She sat there and told me exactly how much I had hurt her, what she had felt then, what she still felt now. I could feel that pain like it was happening to me for real. Then I died. And I remember rising upward, no body, just this transparent outline of myself. I saw another outline, and when we touched, it was like we merged. I don't remember every word that passed between us, but I do remember making a choice to come back down. The strangest part is that the faces in these dreams are almost always blurred. I can focus on places, objects, voices, emotions, but not faces. It's like I'm meant to remember the shape of things, not the identities. And here's the part that still gets me. In real life, I eventually did get checked and found out I actually have ADHD. I'm on medication now, and it's helped me more than I can say. Life feels easier, clearer, more possible. And sometimes I sit there thinking about that dream life, the one where I found out too late, and I can't help wondering if that dream was the reason I finally looked into it here. So yeah, I know how all of this sounds. I know it's a lot. But when you live through enough moments that feel like memories before they happen, it changes the way you move through the world. It makes reality feel thinner somehow. And even now, I still don't know whether these were dreams, warnings, borrowed memories, or something else entirely. I just know they felt real. And some days, they still do.